Okay, we are live now. So, hello, everybody, and welcome to Why Read episode number 32. And in this episode, I am so honored and excited to invite my guest, Lectin, from the channel Reading from the Depths. Is that how you say the channel
Yeah.
name? Did I get that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And Philip Chase, returning guest, otherwise known as Dr. Fantasy on parts of BookTube. And of course, on this series, we always begin with the same question, which is why read? Why do we read in this busy time when we are constantly being bombarded with different information, when there are so many different things competing for our attention, for our time and attention, so many distractions, so much the urge to doom scroll, whatever it is? Why pick up a book of all things?
Hmm.
Why read? And so I'm very excited to hear some answers to this question today. And Lectin, since you are our new guest to the Why Read series, I'm very excited to ask you this question. Why read?
Well, first off, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this series. And it's nice to be here with you and with you, Philip. Um, why read? I've been thinking about this a lot, especially the last decade or so. I've come to new ideas with it. And I'll start by saying that I do have pleasure when I read a lot, and it's for pleasure. There is enjoyment. And a lot of time when I talk about why I read and how I read, some people think that I'm over analytical and over analyzing things, and I take the joy out of it, the fun out of it. So I don't think that's the case, but it can seem that way when I talk about it a lot. So I'll just preface it by saying there's joy there, right? Part of reading is experiencing joy, but there's a way I go about doing it. Um, my history is my undergraduate degree. I have degrees in theater and religious studies, and my graduate degree is a Master's of Divinity, which is a ministerial degree. So it's a degree in Buddhist ministry. And at my program, there weren't a lot of classes oriented around non-Christian students at the time that I took it. So it was very academics focused. So the world of religious academia is kind of where I find one of my homes. And one of the things that stuck out a lot in my graduate work is this idea that myth making is what makes human history human. And what I mean by that is we tell myths as a way to understand the world around us and to understand how we exist in the world. And when I talk about myths, I don't just mean myths about why it's flooding or why there's an earthquake or why some year crops grow and some years crops don't grow. We tell myths all the time. So those are types of myths, but we also tell myths, like in my case, what it means to be a good son, what it means to be a brother, an uncle, what it means to be a monk, what it means to be an American, right? These are all myths we tell. There are students every day that recite the Pledge of Allegiance in the morning at school. That is myth making in action. And the thing with myth making is that you're not just describing the world around you, you're also prescribing how you exist in that world, right? What it means to be a person in that world. And so for me, the heart of that is storytelling. The heart of that is narrative. So the power of story, whether it be these grandiose myths about the creation of existence or it be a novel that I'm reading, it is telling me something about the world and about my place in the world and how I choose to interact with the world. So that is kind of the conceptual way I go about reading. I think storytelling and narrative are vitally important for understanding how I exist in the world and how I want to exist in the world. And that's true even with stories that I'm reading that are fantastical or horrific. I especially read a lot of genre fiction. I'm not saying this is a world I want to live in. I'm not saying these are people I want to be like. But by reading, I have a mirror almost for me to understand something about myself and the world I live in. So that's the basis for when I engage in literature or art in general, but especially text and literature. Now, on top of that, as a monk, people expect me and I expect myself to be living a spiritual life, right? So there's the question, why are you not like meditating or why are you not studying or doing what is expected of a monk? And why are you engaging in worldly actions like reading horror stories, as it may be, or sci-fi or fantasy or whatever it is? And something that is important to me, and I talk about it a lot in my teachings to students, is that, and obviously this goes for me who's choosing to live a spiritual life, but also for anyone that's trying to live a spiritual life. And what I mean by that is a life where you're making your life meaningful, right? You're trying to find meaning and purpose in your life by whichever avenue you choose to. If you come to a Buddhist teaching or any teaching and your Buddhist practice exists on the meditation cushion, or it exists when you're in temple or gompa or when you're reciting prayers, that's a very limited practice. you have to have something to bring that spiritual life with you outside into the real world, right? The real world where it's messy, where you're dealing with kids and family and work and school. And if your only experience of a spiritual journey or a human progress is in these limited scenarios, then you are not fulfilling your potential as a human or as a spiritual person. And so for me, it's important to bring the spiritual into the mundane, right? To the idea that there's this distinction between the sacred and the profane, I think is something we can collapse and we can take our practice, whatever it may be, into our worldly life. And so for me, a big part of that is engaging in pop culture in one way or another. So when I am reading or listening to music or on occasion watching television or movies, I try to go about doing that in such a way that it is a spiritual practice. And what I mean by that is I'm looking for something as I read that is, again, showing me something about myself. It's showing me what kind of person I want to be. It's showing me something about the world, showing me what, and even if the story itself doesn't have that content, right? It doesn't have a particular person or an idea or ideal that I'm enamored with, I still have myself to look at. So never mind the world in the text, I have me, the world in front of the text, which is to say I read a text and I say, why am I responding to this? What emotions are being riled up because of whatever I'm reading? And even at that level, I have something to learn about myself. So no matter what I'm reading, what I'm engaging, I'm learning something about myself. And that is why I read, is because I want to learn more about myself and how I exist in the world and how I can be of benefit to others in the world and work on myself in that way. So from my side, that is why I read, which again sounds like I'm overly analytical and that I'm doing a whole lot of like boring work on the outside. But once you have a habit of engaging in text that way, I fall into a world the same as anyone else does, you know? But then afterwards, I take a step back and then I have a bigger view of what I'm doing. So I do find a lot of joy in reading. It's a very joyful, pleasant experience. And this is just like secondary or like substrata for when I do it. So that's my long-winded kind of answer to why I read.
I love that answer, and I would argue that maybe I don't know what this says about me, but I find that process fun and
Yeah,
enjoyable. I find the
that's
process fun and enjoyable, even if I'm not enjoying the content and learning something about myself in that process, like, "Oh, wow, this did not sit well with me," or "This worked for me and why?" And then
mm,
questioning that and learning something about myself and where I am now, maybe versus where I was before this book or after. I find the whole process, that journey of exploration, fun and enjoyable. I know not everybody reads for that purpose, but I think that's a worthwhile reason to read, especially if it
yeah,
could get you to question your own narrative or to take a step back, like you said, because I think that's the
mm,
beauty of story. It's so easy in our lives to turn on a news story, for example, and buy into something that's said and not take the time to critically examine it and look at
mm-hmm,
evidence, look at things a little bit with a little bit of distance. And I think
yeah.
reading fiction is a form of pleasure and immersion, but can also be a way to take a step back and to look at things and evaluate things in that way as well.
Yeah, definitely. Especially because in fiction, and especially genre fiction, you aren't confined by the limits of reality. So you
Yeah.
can take things that you want to talk about and exaggerate them in ways that work for the story. And you couldn't do that in many other types of artistic expression if you're penned in by reality, right? So in genre fiction, especially, you can have hyperbole, but it makes sense. So everything can be turned up more, which gives you a greater chance to look at humanity and like how you exist in relation to that, I think.
Yes, and I love, by the way, how you brought in your Buddhism to that too, saying it's one thing to meditate and to stay, in the confines
Mm,
of a religion or a spiritual practice, but to engage, to go further, to challenge yourself in the confines of fiction, in the safe space of that, and into the imagination, the aspects of fiction and fantasy, what that can
mm.
do for you as far as challenging that as well. I think that that's so worthwhile. I think I just appreciate this answer so much. I want to add before we ask Philip this question or get him to respond, either one you want to do first, Philip. I want to highlight Matt's comment here because he said, in response to this, I read to commune with the collective humanity that's come before me and of
Mm,
the now, the human experience, what we've been able to perceive in our time existing. So,
mm.
just a beautiful reflection on what you said. So, well put, Matt. And I guess I wanna go ahead and I will get to some more of this chat. Thank you all so much for being here, by the way, in the chat. You know that you all mean so much to me when you're there, and I always apologize that I can never highlight or get to every single comment in the chat, but you are seeing, and I appreciate you all. But I want to go over to Philip. Philip, I don't know if you want to respond to that first or answer the why read question for yourself first. Either order. But
I definitely want to respond to that. What a beautiful answer, Lecton, that you gave to the question. I really enjoyed everything you had to say there. That was lovely. And it's something I've been thinking about myself a lot lately. Actually, I recently made a video that I decided to title How Stories Make Us Human. And this is me reflecting about some similar things, actually, and how, I've read a few books in the past on the topic. One that springs to mind is Yuval Harari's *Sapiens*, where he uses the term the storytelling creature, which I don't think he invented, but it's such a great way to think of ourselves, because we do surround ourselves with narrative. We do surround ourselves with story. And to a great degree, our individual identities rest on story. Our very faulty memories strung together to form a kind of narrative, which is what we think of us as ourselves, or as you alluded to, national identity is a narrative. I feel like it's a narrative that we often quarrel over. There are competing narratives for this is what it means to be an American. No, this is what it means, and this is something that is an ongoing struggle in many ways. And a lot of times it's people trying to assert a narrative that they think would be our best selves, or their particular vision, which may be in competition with a different particular vision. So it's just fascinating. And in so many realms, we see how storytelling is at the heart of what we're doing. Even something as maybe at first glance might seem as different a realm as science. I think of science often as simply the attempt to string together a narrative based on the evidence we have in order to tell a compelling story about what we see. Our history most certainly is an attempt to impose a narrative on the evidence we have at hand in order to make sense of the past. So I really appreciate that answer. I also love what Matt wrote in the comments that you highlighted earlier. What a wonderful, statement that Matt made there. I think very, very, very well and very concisely. But yeah, I find myself, just to add a little bit, I guess, because I have answered this question before for you, Joanna. But I find myself reflecting a lot lately on fulfillment and creativity. I was having a really nice conversation with my wife the other day about that. And what are the activities that I emerge from feeling the most fulfilled in my life? And they're often very creative activities. And I do think of reading as being, even though I'm not the one when I'm reading who's made the story, I am creating the story in here. And that, to me, there's just something very fulfilling about the act of creation, about creating. And I find myself emerging from that process feeling very fulfilled. And that goes for writing especially. I especially feel that when I'm writing, just when I'm engaged and immersed and lost in the world that I'm conjuring for myself and hopefully eventually for other people. But even as a reader, I appreciate how I can engage with a story. And having created that as a result of the what's given to me on the page, the symbols on the dead tree that my brain interprets a certain way, and that is an act. I think we are made in such a way that we need to create. I find that creativity is at the heart of us, especially when we're at our best. I think so. I think that one reason I read is to feel a sense of fulfillment in creation. So yeah.
That's fascinating. I have a question. Since Lecton, you brought up myth, and I've had this question for a while. I know that my friend here, Fantasy Awash, she did a wonderful video a long while back about Gilgamesh and how it's the first fantasy story. And it was an excellent video. I highly recommend everybody checking it out. I have heard since then there are some people who consider, when it comes to the genre of fantasy, that maybe some of those early epics or were not necessarily considered fantasy, if there's a distinction there. Do you draw a distinction between that, Philip, or do you think you would equate those being the same?
I do. I think modern fantasy as a genre draws a lot from much older stories, and that is one reason why I love fantasy, because I'm somebody who I make my living out of studying old stories, and so that there are links, there are commonalities, but there are differences as well. If you look at much older stories like the Iliad or Gilgamesh or the Mahabharata or what have you, these are collective properties of a sort. These are communal. These are stories that belong to a people. They express they're the expressions of a people's dream, as it were. Whereas a fantasy is an individual's dream, which takes much inspiration from the collective, but it is an individual thing. I think that's an important distinction. Because there is also, in many cases, an element of belief as well when you're talking about the much older stories. But a lot of commonalities too, because they are ways of trying to figure out life and our experiences and make sense of the world around us and impose a narrative once again. So the important things I think they do have in common. But I think those distinctions are also probably worth pondering, that in the case of the myths and stuff. But I don't know, what would Lecton say about that, the difference there?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on a lot of what I think are the big differences. I think the big thing is that when we engage in like contemporary fantasy, we engage with it as an unreal world. And when we, in the contemporary world, engage with these epics, we engage with them as unreal stories. But at the time of their creation and their exposure and their consumption, they were telling about reality, right? They weren't describing a fantastical world. They were describing reality as it was experienced by people. And I mean, myth making is an interesting idea, and it's one I like a lot. But also, it's like a four-letter word sometimes, because the idea, if I call something mythological, am I immediately saying it is not true, quote unquote? And how do I define true? And so I think at the time of the creation of many of these stories, they wouldn't be looked at as what we think of as contemporary fantasy, insofar as they believe them to be accurate descriptions of the world. Whereas right now, we're talking about the use of narrative and storytelling as a way to experience and understand reality, but not as a one-to-one description of reality. So in that way, I think they're different. But I think there's enough overlap that it's useful for us to explore them as pieces of fantastical literature, and also look at contemporary fiction as myth and see how those two things overlap and how our categories sometimes get really fuzzy at the intersection between those. I think is a useful enterprise.
Ah, that's so interesting. Okay, that makes a lot more sense to me now. I've had some struggles understanding what the distinction was, but I think that's very well put.
If you want to look at the origins of fantasy as a modern genre, I think you need to look at the 19th century, where you see, as part of the Romantic movement and the neo-Gothic movement, a kind of idealizing of the past. Certainly in the Western context, if we're talking about modern fantasy, it emerges with writers like William Morris, who was, in a way, protesting the ugliness of the present as made by industrialism and capitalism, looking around at a society where he felt people were without a place, that people were alienated, that we no longer took care of one another, that we had become mercenary in our relationships with each other. And so it was a very idealistic view of the past, but he and other thinkers like him looked to older times, like the Middle Ages, for example, and thought, at least you knew who you were back then, and at least you knew who your people were. And yes, there was a social hierarchy, but people took care of each other. And and there was so fantasy emerged as a kind of protest against the practices that people like William Morris thought were alienating people, and as an assertion of an ideal vision, let's say, of a world where alternatives are possible, like as Lecton was saying earlier. Genre fiction allows the freeing of the imagination to imagine worlds where we either see the horrors of where we could go, or we see the ideal of what we could be. You can portray anything within that range, really.
At the same time, when you talk about that, though, that is actually very similar to the way a lot of scholars of religion think about the interplay between myth and ritual. And so going especially to someone like Mircea Eliade, who is
Uh-huh.
not really popular anymore, but he's an early 20th century scholar of religion. And one of his most famous contributions is this idea of the eternal return, or the return to the sacred. So he has this idea that the performance of ritual is a way to reclaim mythological status and mythological time. And so the reason ritual exists in a religious context is to reclaim the mythic and the origin of what you were as a being.
Yeah.
And so the idea, but this goes to what you were saying earlier, is that you read to feel fulfillment through the creative process, right?
Yeah.
So that itself can be looked at as a ritual performance, right? There's something about performance that creates reality,
Yeah.
right? Whether that
I think
performance is through reading or
Eliade,
consumption.
he literally referred to it as creation time, I believe, that
Yeah,
you
yeah.
return to. So yeah, very aptly said, I think. Yeah.
That's fascinating. I'd never thought about rituals in that context before. So I'm gonna have to take
Yeah.
that in. That's really fascinating.
I mean,
Uh,
for me, I mean, again, just coming from the study of religion, like what I was, and combining theater and religion, the idea of performance as a type of creation is always really interesting to me. And ritual is something we do to create us closer to our in-group, obviously, but it also, and like define us as against our out-group. That's part of being in a community of one specific type. But ritual is bringing you to something that your normal everyday human experience, you use the mundane world to tap into the sacred world, right? So you use what meager existence you have as a human to become something more than human. And that is an act of creation, right? It's an act of going to something outside of yourself. And so this idea of not just writing or doing other creative acts, but reading itself as a type of creation, I think is really interesting, as you were talking about earlier, Philip.
Yeah.
yeah, that is that's a really interesting take. The reading as creation. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and catch up on the chat a little bit here because there were a lot of really good comments while you two were talking. So I know that John, I'll go ahead and highlight John's comment here because I was going to wait to highlight this, but he was making a joke about your early Christmas decorations, Lechton.
No, that is an altar. That's my altar.
Yes, yes, and then
Yeah.
he was correcting himself on that. So
They do
yeah,
look like fish tanks, though. You're right. That's correct.
yes,
It's often in Tibetan that the inside of altars are painted sky blue. You know what I mean?
yeah.
So you get this water effect. It's supposed to be the clouds, I think, but
Oh, that's cool. Yeah.
similar.
Yeah, no, I totally got that, but he was just joking about that. But yes,
No.
no, that's a real thing. And you are actually at a monastery in Tibet, is that or
No,
in
in
India?
southern
In
India.
India,
So
sorry.
it's a Tibetan Buddhist monastery, but in
Tibetan Buddhist.
1959, when the Dalai Lama left Tibet, and he moved to exile, many of the monks followed him. And in the late 60s, early 70s, they were given land by the Indian government in a couple different states, and they restarted some of the main monastic institutions. So I'm at Sarajay Monastery, which is down in Balakupa, which is in Karnataka. I'm near Bangalore, if you know anything about South India. And so at my monastery, there are about 3,000 monks, give or take. And most of us is considered a monastic university. So we are training in my lineage to get this degree called the Geshe degree. And it takes about 25 years, at least in my monastery. Some of them are a little shorter at different monasteries. But so that's where I am. I'm in South India.
That's
But it's
right.
a
And you
Tibetan
were
Buddhist
saying that you're
monastery.
about halfway through that training, that 25-year training?
Yeah. I moved here in 2011. I ordained in 2012, the very beginning in January, and started right away. So I've been here since then. Yeah. But they keep adding years. It keeps getting longer and longer. They just added another year to it. So, we'll see how long I'm
Wow.
here.
Goodness. And we also have Nerdy Kathy in the chat, who is fantastic. Love her channel. And just also some wonderful responses, like I said here. Summer says, I completely agree. I love creating, whether it's story, music, art, design. So many creative endeavors spark so much joy. And we have Bookish here in the chat, a channel I absolutely love. And so do you mind if I ask you, by the way, Lecton, how you became a Buddhist monk or
No,
what drew you to that?
no, I don't mind. It's kind of hijacking your channel a little bit, but so I'm from New England area, from outside of Boston, from Worcester, for those of you that are from New England. And I grew up in an Episcopalian household, going to church, and very, very active in the church since a young age. I sang in the choir. I was an altar boy. I was the head altar boy. I read lessons. I was part of the youth group. I did all of those things, and I never believed any of it. I thought it was all a show that people did for social status. And so I was very cynical. And I didn't think anyone believed it, actually, to be honest. I couldn't understand why people believed it. And um, I saw kind of political things happening behind the scenes and people using religion as a way to kind of gain some sort of power and control over people. So I became very cynical. So as a teenager, I was incredibly cynical. And I decided that all religion was inherently harmful. And I was going to go to university and study about religion to prove how wrong it was, which is an awful reason to do anything. But as an angry 17-year-old, that made sense, right? It's incredibly cynical and it's not a good attitude, but that's where I was. Yet at the same time, so that was like one motivating factor is I thought I was smarter than everyone and smarter than religion, whatever that means, right? But at the same time, it must have been around my senior year of high school. My choir master, who I'd sung with since I was maybe 9 years old, developed pancreatic cancer. And he wasn't actively leading the choir anymore. We had someone else. And we weren't allowed to see him because he got sick and he went downhill really quickly. So I had written him a letter just to say how important he was in my life because he, was really useful for me when I was a young kid. And then when he passed away at his memorial service, his husband asked me to read a section of that letter as part of service. And I was like, yeah, sure, no problem. I was already like stage managing everything. And there's, 450 people there in attendance and 150 singers. And I was kind of doing all the behind the scenes things. And then his sister read something. And then it was my turn to get up and read. And I stood at the lectern and I stood there for over a minute, not saying anything. Because I realized if I opened my mouth, I was going to burst into tears. And I realized I didn't have any language to understand my grief or my trauma or my experience. And I knew that the language I was being offered by this type of Christianity wasn't a language that worked for me, but I needed something. So I went to college with these dueling ideas. One, that religion is inherently going to harm people, and I was cynical of it. And two, that I was missing something important in my life, and I didn't know what it was. And I took a class on Buddhism my first year, and it was an overview course, and things just clicked into place, and I felt like I was coming home to something that I didn't know I had left. Everything just made sense in a way. And so then I had a chance to live with other students who were interested in studying Buddhism and Buddhist meditation. And I had a chance to lead that community at my undergraduate. And I just started studying more and more, and I became a practitioner. I took refuge. And when it became time for grad school, I was also a theater tech. I was a stage manager. I was a lighting designer. And I was working as a professional theater technician. So after I graduated from undergraduate, they created a position for me full-time at my university to do stage work. And finally, I decided, okay, I'll go into a master's program in religious studies because I really like this. And a master's program is quick. It's only 2 years. And if I don't like it, I'll just move to New York and be a theater techie, and that's fine. And if I like it, I can roll it into a PhD. And so I was looking into programs, and I knew that Harvard Divinity School offered a master's of divinity in Buddhism. I didn't really know anything else about it. I didn't understand the difference between a master's of divinity versus a master's in religious studies. But I knew a Buddhist practitioner who had gone through it. So I said, well, I'll apply to it. And I applied and I got in. And at first they didn't offer me any money, and I couldn't take out $35,000 a year for 3 years to go there. So I said I wasn't going to go. And then my advisor convinced me to contact Harvard to renegotiate my financial aid. And before I could, they emailed me and said, we've renegotiated your financial aid, and so you don't have to pay anything. So then I went there, which was training to be a minister, right? And to be a minister in their eyes is to use whatever your spiritual or religious tradition is to serve others. So it's a very vague, very open idea of what it means to be a minister. And so at that point, I knew I was connected to a Buddhist community in the area, in Medford, and I was doing a little bit of teaching, doing a lot of work. And in my head, I thought, I want to become a monk. But at the same time, I was in a long-term relationship. I'd been with my partner for almost 10 years at that point. And so I said, well, this is kind of where I've committed my life right now. So we'll see what happens. And, my partner was a little bit older than me, or quite older than me. So I'm like, well, maybe eventually he'll die and then I'll become a monk in 20 years. We'll see. I was very kind of left things open-ended. And then one day I was with my teacher, Kabje Lamazopin Bichet, and he was touring, and I was attending him and serving him dinner. And I told him, I don't know what I want to do. I don't know if I want to continue with the PhD. I want to keep studying the Dharma, and not in like in a really deep way. And he said, become a monk, go to Serge, get your Geshe degree. And then as soon as he said it, it was very clear that it was the right thing, that it was what I wanted to do. And so I told my partner, and he said, perfect, of course you're going to become a monk. And I told my family, and they said, yeah, of course, like what else would you do? So everyone in my family was on board, and so I had a lot of support. None of them are Buddhist, by the way, but they just realized how transformative it was for me. And so, following the advice of my teachers, with the blessings of my family, I did one more year working after graduating at the Buddhist center, and then I moved to India, and I've been here ever since.
That's an incredible story. Thank you so much for sharing that. Um, and it's interesting because you were bringing up some religious conflict that you've had.
Mhm.
And my friend here, Philip Chase, has actually written a trilogy called the Eden Trilogy, which deals with a lot of religious conflict. And I know that you, Philip, have talked about how your series has been a way of you grappling with your own questions regarding that topic. Is that correct?
Very much so. Yeah. I grew up, actually, I attended an Episcopal church when I was in college. So I'm pretty familiar with Episcopalianism. But I grew up a PK, a preacher's kid, just sort of my father's United Church of Christ pastor. So mainline Protestant. And never had a moment where I just sort of said, no, this is not for me. I just sort of gradually realized that I don't really believe of the things I'm supposed to believe anymore. And so, you know, I just sort of spent a few years trying to figure out my relationship with that religion, which I still have a lot of affection for in many ways. And I feel that there's a lot of good things going on, that there's a lot of possibility for people to do good things within their understanding of their faith within Christianity, various types. But I personally felt like a little bit like Lecton, I guess, that I was searching, I guess, for something that made a little more sense to me, that spoke to me. And I had the opportunity to live in South Asia, in Nepal, although I did travel all over South India too. So I loved South India a lot. But I lived in Nepal, and while I was there, I have not studied nearly as much as Lecton. I have not studied formally at all, but just I read the Mahabharata, and I read the Ramayana, and I read books about, that's Hinduism, of course, but I also read about Buddhism as well, because in Nepal, you should understand. I don't know if everyone knows this, but in Nepal, it's very difficult to divide Buddhism and Hinduism because the two just overlap so much. It's not like, if you go to a Hindu temple, you'll see statues of the Buddha there. Or if you go to a Buddhist temple, you'll see statues of Indra and whatnot, in Nepal. So there's all kinds of overlap there. And people just are totally cool with that, in a way that's different from the West, where we tend to sort of separate, segregate. No, this is this and this is that. They're totally fine with, they're very laid back about the overlap, that they're comfortable with that in ways that we're not, I've found. But yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed immersing myself as much as I could in that culture and learning about that perspective. And I've read a bit since, just as a lay person, as an amateur, not seriously, but I enjoy reading about Buddhism. And so, yeah, I think in some ways, although it's a fantasy, it's genre fiction, there's action, there's a war going on, there are characters on their journey, but underlying it all is this exploration of this tension within myself between how I grew up, that faith, and the way of understanding the universe that I increasingly felt myself being attracted to. Fundamentally, two great insights that I think Buddhism, as I understand it at least, and Lecton, please correct me, but if I'm wrong, but one of the fundamental insights being, I'm not permanent, I'm just a little fella after all, right? In this vast world. But also simultaneously, I am part of everything, that I am connected to all the life around me. And that just made great sense to me. Reading about those insights gave me great peace. And I felt that they helped me in so many facets of my life, from just little things to being okay with losing a tennis game, to motivating myself to be a writer, to feel like this is my contribution. This is what I can do, and this is how I
Did
can
you
connect.
find that engaging in that kind of conversation and that struggle in your creative outlet that affected you as you were doing it? You know what I mean? It wasn't like you had already decided this was the struggle I went through, so now I'm going to put a version of it on paper. But
Right.
the act of creating your trilogy, did that also then change your experience of,
Yes.
yeah?
Yes. It was a very affirmative experience in that regard. And I was, as I was writing, working this out. And you can maybe even, I think, maybe see an evolution through the trilogy as well in that regard. But yeah, it was.
I do have your trilogy, by the way. I purchased it
Oh,
recently. I haven't had a chance to read it, though. I was hoping to read the first one before today's conversation, but it just didn't happen.
no worries. No worries. Yeah. Yeah. No, but that is correct, John. I do feel that I was wrestling with this, in a way that I found very helpful, as Lecton just pointed out, that this was a process that creativity helped me to arrive at a place where I was at peace with how I feel I fit in the universe.
Yes, I can relate very much. I grew up Catholic, so a little bit different here, but I think I entered
I
more
mean,
into.
Episcopalians are diet Catholic. It's really close.
That's right. Catholic, right. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, I went to Catholic school and elementary school, and I think I found myself being mostly agnostic by the time I was a teenager, but very uncomfortable with that. Very uncomfortable with agnosticism. It was very scary for me. I felt like there was a lot of pressure somehow, whether it was pressure I put on myself or pressure I felt from the outside, that you need to know what you believe. Like you're in trouble in this life if you don't know what you believe. So I was really scared. I think I went through a lot of fear in my life because of that. And then I'll just fast forward to, I guess it was like 12, 14 years, maybe 14 years ago now, which is crazy. I ended up getting back together with my high school ex-boyfriend who became a soldier in the war and then a veteran. Long story with him. Shout out to the ex. But he ended up coming out of that situation, which was very difficult for him, PTSD and everything. He ended up going to Nepal. He went to Kathmandu and he ended up going to a monastery there and studied Buddhism for a month, and it changed him. And that was around the time
Any
that
chance it was? Do you know the monastery?
I
Could have
don't.
been.
I
There's a
don't.
monastery outside of Kathmandu called Kopan Monastery, and they do a 1 month Dharma course every year, right around November, December. And I was just invited to teach there. I was supposed to be there this week, actually, but I
Wow.
turned it down. Not for that
Wow.
course, but that's the monastery that my teacher founded, or he was one of the founders of it. So I'm familiar with it. So it sounds like it could be
Oh,
there because they do 1 month courses. So there's a
that's so
connection.
cool. Yeah, it was really an amazing time to get back in touch with him because we had just
Mm,
gotten back in touch for the first time in 10, 12 years or so. Maybe not that long. I don't remember exact details now. But he brought me a journal from from that area from Kathmandu that I still own. And he had a very profound, uh, life-altering experience. He ended up becoming a Buddhist after that. He ended up like, instead of, I think, the type of Buddhism that was there specifically at that monastery, he specifically joined a Buddhist, tradition that my friend here on BookTube is part of called the Diamond Way Buddhism, which is slightly
mm,
different. It doesn't quite follow the Dalai Lama specifically, but I don't know if he's still affiliated with that or not. I just know I actually went to a Buddhist retreat with him for a weekend. So I've been to a Buddhist
mm,
retreat before
mm,
and had a great time. And I have never myself proclaimed myself a Buddhist, but like Philip, I've read some Buddhist texts. I read several Thich Nhat Hanh books, and
mm.
I just find what I've learned and what I can take from it is beautiful to the point where if I find it in literature, I get very excited if I find that
Yeah.
influence. So, like, for example, I got so excited. My review of The Way of Edan is called Elves and Buddhism. That's what I titled that. And I highly recommend if either, I know Philip hasn't read this yet, but if you've ever checked out any Ursula K. Le Guin, Lecton, have you ever read Le Guin
Yeah,
before?
I have, but I haven't read that one though.
Ah, yes, because I know she was specifically influenced by Taoism, if I understand
Mm,
correctly. This particular book, there is a chapter where I feel like it's so influenced by Buddhism. Like the
Mm.
character is talking to his friends as a teen, and he's talking about all these revelations about how life is suffering. And the problem is we don't suffer enough, that we try to avoid it and that we grasp at happiness. But if we went through it, if we went through the suffering, that we could come on the other side and see that there is a self that's suffering and that there's something beyond that. And it,
Mm.
it definitely alludes to so many Buddhist philosophy just in this one passage. But at the same time, I read that and it's early in the story. So I'm not giving anything away about the book, but I did have the thought, this is
Mm.
very untested. This kid is very young. He hasn't been out yet. And this is before he actually has to go to another planet. I don't want to get too much into the plot of the story, but it has to do with a planet that's very capitalist, that's very much
Mm.
analogous to our planet, very greedy, a lot of war, a lot of strife, and very much, yeah, a capitalist planet. Whereas he lives on a moon planet that's a dystopian, utopian planet that's very anarchist in the sense that they're against owning property or using money. Everything is very free oriented. And so he has these revelations about life, but it's before he has traveled to this other
Mm.
planet and gets tested. He gets his
Yeah.
beliefs tested, he gets everything tested, and I love the ambiguity that Le Guin brings into her
Mhm.
writing, into that exploration. I thought it was so well told. But I
I think
light up
that kind of
anytime I see those influences.
that kind of goes to even what you said with your story is that when you kind of realized you were living in this agnostic place, it was scary, right? Because we're not used to not knowing. And getting comfortable with not knowing is really a powerful experience, but it's a really difficult experience, right? And being comfortable to say, I don't know. And I'm existing in a place where I don't have answers, but I'm happy to seek for them and I'm happy to look for meaning in different ways and take things that improve my life and make me a better person. But like living in that space of not knowing can be very terrifying because we want to control things, right? We want to control the
Yes.
world around us, and we believe that if we can control it, then we can not experience the suffering. That's the idea, right? By being able to control things, then I can only get what I want and avoid the things I don't want. And that's obviously not true. So then when things don't go our way, it compounds our experience of grief, right? So it's interesting that sometimes you have to be tested to see what you're willing, what you know and what you don't know, and how you can be comfortable in that space that's neither here nor there, but is willing to accept both. You know, I think whenever the Dalai Lama speaks in America, especially, and he gives like public talks, so it's not like specific talks to Dharma students, he says, "Look, it's not my job to make more Buddhists. I'm just talking about my experience, and if what I say is useful for you, then great, you should practice it. And if it's not useful, then you can just forget it. Like that's fine. You know, like the point is to find what works and resonates with you to make you a better person. And so for me, getting back to our channel a little bit, to our discussion, I find so much in literature and in all types of literature that shows me what it means to be a good person,
Yeah.
right? And so part of my experience of not knowing and being comfortable with being an ordinary person who is suffering all the time, right? Because that's part of living in the world, is that I don't have the answers, but I can find things that are reflections of answers and reflections of myself in art. And so art gives me a way to navigate the not knowing that I have, you know?
Mm.
Yes. Oh, beautifully said. And it's interesting as I've gotten older, because, like I said, being a teenager, it was terrifying. I remember being so scared about the fact that I was agnostic. Like, oh no, I cannot die and not know what I believe in. There was some weird fear there, and I just don't know where that came from. But it could be very much like what you said, that it's a way of avoiding suffering, and there was some kind of security that was
Mm-hmm.
associated with that. Whereas now I find myself on a very different side of the coin. I find myself almost scared to believe in certain things. Like if I have a
Mm.
belief, I want to hold it lightly. And I find the books that I resonate with the most over the last several years have been books that have explored uncertainty. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, Philip Chase and I are huge fans of a series called Malazan Book of the Fallen by Stephen
Mm-hmm.
Erickson. I don't know if you've heard
Mm-hmm.
of it. Like, have you heard of it?
Oh, I've heard of it, and it's on my list.
Yeah.
It's on my list. I actually, the strange way I heard of it is there is a podcast I listen to that has to do with movies. It's a movie podcast, and one of the podcasters started a YouTube channel where he's just going through those books in a book club with him and one friend, and they've gotten through the first 5 of them. I think it's been going on for like 4 or 5 years. That's all they do. So hearing him talk about it, I was motivated to read it. But I'm also just like a 10 book series is like a big thing to bite off.
It's a
Never
lot.
mind the complexity that everyone says about. Never mind that. Just like 10 books is like a lot to bite off. So it's in the future. That's part of the reason I started reading the Robin Hobb series, The Realm of the
Mhm.
Elderlings, is because it is 16 books, but they're broken up into sections, right? So I can read the Farseer trilogy. I just finished the second one yesterday. So I can read those three and then take a break, right? And then come back in with the next trilogy after that. So it's not like continuous. So trying to balance.
I'll be very curious, Lecton, to hear your thoughts as you read through Realm of the Elderlings on the two types of magic that exist in that world, the wit and the skill. But as you get further, I think this will make more sense. How they may reflect a kind of Buddhist understanding of the world. I'll be very curious to hear what you think about that as you
Yeah,
progress.
I'm excited. I'm excited to see. Yeah.
I'm so excited to hear your thoughts on that. I mean, I've only read the first trilogy. I've only read the Farseer trilogy, but I
Hmm.
even felt like I got some sense of that, like
Mhm.
Hmm.
some questions of self and of being present, and I don't know, just certain sentiments that I felt like spoke to a non-dual way of seeing things,
By the time
perhaps.
you get to the third trilogy, Tawny Man especially, I think you'll see
Hmm.
what I mean more.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah,
Yeah,
beautiful.
it's interesting. All the content I've seen about the books of Malazan, it's either they love it and it's an incredible series, or it's too dense and they can't deal with it. I don't see any middle ground. It's either people
Mm.
really love the series or they have a hard time.
We have a lot of
What is
thoughts
your
about that.
experience? Yeah, I'm
Me
sure you
too.
do.
Me
I'll let
too.
Philip start first, but I'll add.
No, I think that is exactly the perception that exists about Malazan. But I don't think it's a matter of it being too dense. What I think is what you see in Malazan is that it's unconventional, at least in fantasy terms. Stephen
Hmm.
Erickson, we're talking about Malazan. We're talking about Malazan Book of the Fall. And by the way, there's another author, Ian Esselmont, who also writes in that world. They created the world together, and he has his own series as well. But the best known series is Malazan Book of the Fallen, the 10 books by Stephen Erickson. So when I say Malazan, that's what I'm really talking about here. The thing that Stephen Erickson does is he does things that are not all that uncommon in literature in general, but perhaps not as common in fantasy. The easiest example being in fantasy, a lot of us expect to follow a protagonist or at least a group of protagonists that we're kind of rooting for, that we're with, and we want to see
Hmm.
the outcome, that these are the. And I think that that's a journey that a lot of people appreciate going on. They
Hmm.
enjoy that experience of
Yeah, a
vicariously
fellowship. Yeah.
a fellowship, yeah, and you get a sense of importance by being with those characters and feeling their impact on the world around them and everything else, and how they can save the world and all that. But Malazan actually gives a much, in my opinion, truer sense of an individual's place in the universe, and you, I think,
Mm.
could appreciate this. In other words, there's no central character. There's no central
Mm.
group of characters. There's a world. There's an immense cast of characters, all of them with their own competing visions and struggles, and sometimes they connect with one another in the most beautiful ways. Sometimes they're foes who suddenly see the humanity in one another, and it's the most beautiful thing. Consistently brings me to tears. Malazan does, as does Realm of the Elderlings. So,
Mm.
but this is the thing I think that trips up a lot of people, because you expect, who's the hero? Who am I supposed to be rooting for here?
Yeah.
And the fact of the
Yeah.
matter is, if you read the first book, Gardens of the Moon, you think you're supposed to be rooting for these Malazans, but when you scratch your head, you think, well, wait a minute, they're part of this acquisitive empire that is
Hmm.
actually doing some kind of bad things in the world, right? So wait, why am I rooting for, and then you get these other perspectives, and he's
Hmm.
constantly changing your perspective on a character, because you think you know that character because you've met that character, but then there'll be a POV chapter later on where you suddenly, oh, that's why oh my goodness, your whole perception just changes of that character.
Yeah.
So it's
I
just
mean, that goes to,
beautiful.
I've been thinking a lot about style and like when you write a book, how you choose to present it, what style you're using, and how that affects the experience.
Mhm.
And I mean, part of this is like, I know, going back to my grad school days, part of anyone that's done any academia, they know that at least in the humanities and especially religious studies, you write in a very specific way that is full of like, $10 words and is really hard to understand sometimes. And you can argue that it's because you want the reader to go slowly and whatever, or it's just because you want to show off how smart you are. But I've read books that it would take me like an hour to go through a page. I remember one book especially called Significations, where I fought with this so hard in grad school. And then the author came and gave a talk in our class, and he was so easy to understand, and it was wonderful. I'm like, why did you write like this? But the style you write in is part of the experience, right? And part of that for me is right now, um, having reread Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy and then the newest book. Part of what he does in that is he uses a different writing style and narrative style for every one of those stories. Like none of them are told the same way. The first one is first person journal entries. The second person is like a political thriller that's all sharp edges. The third person in the third book goes back and forth between multiple perspectives, and it feels like you're spiraling out of control because it's going back and forth in time and space. And the fourth book is split up into these three distinct sections, one of which is like the worst fever dream you've ever had. The opening chapter of that last section is called "Fuck the Chicken." Like that's where you get like it's crazy. But there's something about utilizing numerous styles because he's trying to play with the audience expectation. And reading Realm of the Elderlings, Robin Hobb's style is so gentle and so slow, but she's giving you this big picture. And I compared it to reading Game of Thrones, and you could see there's so many parallels between those two, at least the first book of each. You can argue they're both set in like a fantasy world based on medieval Europe, and they have magic systems that some people are kind of born into and they have to learn how to use and others don't know. And there's all this political intrigue. It's based on these courts. But in The Realm of the Elderlings, you follow one character slowly through his experience as opposed to jumping back and forth between multiple perspectives. And that experience just changes the way you read the book, right? It changes your experience of that narrative. And so I've been thinking a lot about style and about even simply like I've written a few short stories recently, and I'm writing one right now, and I'm struggling between if I want to be writing it wants me to write it in present tense as opposed to like close third person. But whenever I write it in present tense and then I read it, it sounds like stage directions, like it just sounds bad. So I'm not doing it well, but like my instinct is to write it in present tense as opposed to like close third person, which is usually like a perfected tense, right? Like a past tense, a past perfected. And just that small distinction creates like a wild distinction of how you read that story and how intimate you are with the characters in the story, the relationship between the reader and the story. So I think a lot about style recently and about how style, very simple stylistic differences, changes the experience of engaging in the world of the story. And I was interested, Philip, when you wrote your trilogy, I know you wrote it over many years, right? It took you a while to write it because it wasn't your full-time job. But how did you just know what the tone was you wanted when you started, or like what you wanted it to feel like, or how did you fall into the feeling and the style of what you wanted it to be?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I think it was a product of my engagement over many years with not only fantasy authors like Tolkien and Le Guin and others who are my heroes, I think of them as being, somehow in my DNA, my literary DNA. But also as a medievalist, I have a soft spot for old words and stuff like that. And Joanna knows very well how many times I've brought up Le Guin's essay From Elfland to Poughkeepsie.
It's a good essay, though, and it's perfect. I had my mom read it, and she said, Joanna, this is what style means. Like, there's a whole entire passage where she describes what style means, and I think you would love it, Lecton. Highly recommend.
Yep. So I got my marching orders from Le Guin, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
I see.
In the sense that I believe that one option that is very attractive to me, especially as a fan of maybe slightly older fantasy, is when an author gives me a sense that I'm immersed in a different world through the language that the author is using, through the prose. The prose is the story. And I appreciate that when, I didn't say Beowulf yet, John, but now I am saying Beowulf. I did say it earlier, maybe anyway. But Le Guin, in that essay essentially puts forth the idea that what you can do as a fantasy author is create a sense that this is not our world, and you do it through the language. And it could be subtle. It's probably better if it's a little more subtle because, frankly, if you overdo it, it looks terrible. And she pointed that out. I think times have changed to a degree where the examples that she gives as being praiseworthy, haven't necessarily aged as well as I think she thought they might have. So she does give Tolkien as an example. I think he's still very readable. But there are some others like Lord Dunsany, for example, whose prose even I regard as a little bit too archaic, a little too stylized. Probably it would be inhibitive for a lot of modern readers for that reason. But I like the idea that somewhere there is a happy medium of where you're trying to tell your reader, signal to your reader through the prose that this is not our world. This is different. And you're somewhere else right now, and we're doing things over here, as opposed to me reading a story and feeling like, gosh, that could be my neighbors here in New Jersey having a conversation. That just, for me, when I'm reading a fantasy that's supposed to be in a different world, a different time from ours, when characters speak that way, it pulls me out of the story. It's immersion breaking for me. So my goal was to make it accessible, but at the same time to allow my reader that immersion where they're feeling like this is, I want my reader to feel bathed in the prose, that this is not our world, but at the same time, it's not something that is prohibiting them from simply enjoying the story. So it's a tough tightrope to walk. It really is.
Yeah.
And
yes, it is, because you want to do it in such a way that you're signaling it to the reader, but not in a way that it's going to take them out of the story and realize I'm being signaled. It just happens naturally and in the flow of the story. Absolutely.
And the more you try it, the better you get at it too.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. I like when authors force something of their reader sometimes, though. And it's not always where you can't always immerse, especially in fantasy. It doesn't always work as well because you are asking so much of the reader to go into other worlds as well, right? So anything you can ease them into being immersed in a new world is useful. But for instance, reading like Hubert Selby Jr. and like Requiem for a Dream and these kind of books, like he doesn't use any punctuation marks, and so you read it and it's like the whole book is like impossible to get through because it's just so hard to read. Not because of the language necessarily, because he doesn't distinguish if someone's talking or if they're not talking. Like there's no punctuation at all, and there's no line breaks in many sections of it. So you're forcing, and also, you know, Requiem for a Dream especially, you might know it if not from the movie, if you haven't read the book, but like it's descent into madness and loss of control. And so something about fighting with the book evokes that experience in the reader, which I think is really useful, you know. And I don't want all my books to be like that, but obviously, you know, like I don't want to struggle with everything I read. But even with fantasy, or with when you have this like really dense language, sometimes you just need to read it more slowly. And that is part of being part of the world. So I like a book that expects something of the reader. I think that's part of this narrative process we're talking about, and part of storytelling is that like part of your storytelling toolkit is to not just like the narrative itself, but it's the way you convey that narrative and how that evokes something in the reader, whether it is you feel comfortable and you feel like you already know where you are, or whether you like have to fight for every inch of this story. And that gives you ownership of it in a way that I think can be really powerful. So
you're going to like Malazan. You're going
yes.
to like Malazan.
So I have so many thoughts I want to share really quickly. So I love everything and echo everything that Philip already said about the series. And I would say that even though it is sprawling in the sense that we have a lot of different characters and we actually go into different continents, and every book actually starts in a different place with a whole different cast of characters, get some crossover characters for sure throughout the series. But there are literally hundreds of characters and perspectives. At the same time, Erickson manages to make it intimate. I thought he had very intimate moments. I'm going to share here. I started a comment here from Nerdy Kathy, who said, Malazan has surprised me by becoming one of my all-time favorite series, and I've only read 4 so far. I highly recommend everyone, if you're a Malazan fan, please check out Nerdy Kathy's channel, because her videos, like specifically all 3 of her videos that I've watched so far, but the Dead House Gates book review, they do have spoilers, but my goodness, what an incredible review of this series, and somebody who really understands that this series gets a big reputation for being complex because there is so much going on storyline wise. Like you could see it as a number of short stories that are woven together. I want to say AP kind of in A Critical Dragon compared it to being a mosaic. Like I don't know if he's the one who came up with that metaphor for the series, in the sense that you have a lot of different storylines, but they all kind of come together as like a mosaic. But the thing that I think people don't talk enough about when it comes to Malazan is how emotional it is. It's a
Hmm.
deeply emotional series, and the heaviness isn't just from the complexity of understanding the storylines. There is some complexity with that, especially when you're dropped into the world. It does, like, for example, in book 1, it is in medias res. He doesn't give you a lot of exposition. You kind of pick up context as you go along, and then you start understanding things as you continue. But there are so many emotional, heavy things that happen in the series. There's also quite a bit of brutality in the series, and I always feel
Hmm.
like I do a disservice by not talking about that enough. There is quite a bit of sexual violence in the series, quite
Hmm.
a bit. And so they're heavy books, not just because of having so many storylines, having so much lore, having so much vastness to the history and to everything that's going on in the empire and the political stuff, but also just the emotion. And it's
Hmm.
also, I found, despite the fact that it is so sprawling, it's incredibly immersive, intimate, and yeah, the other thing too to say in regards to style that's interesting about Malazan, and this is something I know, Philip, that you've talked about numerous times, is that Erickson has this incredible range that he displays throughout the series as a writer. So you have military fantasy aspects, you have banter between soldiers, the boots on the ground type of dialogue that happens, but you also have political aspects to the story. You have emotional philosophical reflections of characters at certain points that are in depth, and then you have these epigraphs that are
Hmm.
poetry at the
Yeah.
beginning of
Hmm.
every chapter that allude to the themes in the chapter and in the series. And there are multiple themes throughout the series. So I think it's just an incredible web of so many things happening, but it's beautiful, and it's something that, like, it does seem a bit complex when you're reading it as a first time reader. I'll say that, but then when you get to the end, it comes to I felt like there was a broader picture that came together for me,
Hmm.
that made it makes it easy when you finish to say, "Well, it's not that complicated," but but it is it's,
Convergence in
powerful.
Malazan terms. Convergence.
Yeah.
Convergence. Yeah, it converges. There you go.
Yeah, Doug, I think the analogy, maybe the one you were thinking of, the AP came up with, is the World War II one. I'm not sure about
Oh.
the Mosaic one, but I know the AP deserves credit for the World War II analogy, with its different theaters. So Book
Hmm.
One in the Malazan Book of the Fallen is in one theater in
Hmm.
Genabakis, and then Book Two goes over to Seven Cities, a totally different continent. And you're like, wait, what happened to these characters that I knew? Well, it's like World War II. It was happening in the Pacific. It was happening in Europe. It was happening in Northern Africa. So there's different theaters. And gradually you see everything sort of converge. Every book has its own convergence, but the series as a whole has
Hmm.
its convergence.
Hmm.
Yeah, that I thought was a really helpful analogy on AP's part, about it being like World War II with these different theaters. Things are happening over here, so let's see what's happening, and then but it's all unrelated under this one big
Hmm.
umbrella. So
I
yeah.
mean, for me, when I have large, kind of expansive stories like that, part of that is I don't mind not knowing where things are going if the author has done a good enough job that I trust that the author knows what they're doing,
Yeah.
right? And so if I read a story and I'm like, what is going on? How can this ever all work together? That's fine. Like, I do not mind that experience as long as the author, I feel they know what's going on, do you know? And
Yes.
that's what's more important. And so when
Yeah.
I read a story and I'm like, okay, they know what they're doing. This does not make any sense. But I trust them due to just the way they're writing, the confidence in the writing, or whatever it may be, the vibes I'm getting from the writing, then I'm happy for a story to have many different theaters that I can trust eventually. They're going to be pieces that fit together in a way that's meaningful, you know? But it's about me having confidence in the author knowing what they're doing. And that is kind of a vibe thing, right? There's no real way to codify that in a meaningful way. But if I have that, then you can take me anywhere, you know?
Oh, that's beautiful to hear because I know that's a big struggle that some people either have it or they don't. I've noticed with the series. They either, and maybe to varying degrees, but for
Yeah.
the most part, people are like, I'm okay. I'm just moving with the things. I know I don't understand everything, but I'm gonna appreciate what I can understand and what I am experiencing. Whereas there are some people like, I can't, I have to know what's going on. I need it
Yeah.
now. I need to understand now. And it's that grasp for certainty, which is ironically a theme in this story. And Erickson points a critical lens at certainty and how much
Yeah.
we as humans feel like we need to have it, and the challenges that with that. That's
Hmm.
he actually said in an interview, and this is one of the main reasons that inspired me to read the series, because I read the first book, loved it. Read the second book, wasn't sure. I just didn't quite. I loved the ending, but I wasn't quite sure about how it was doing so many different things than I was expecting.
Hmm.
And then I listened to an interview with him that was brilliant. And in the interview, he said, certainty is not a virtue. And when he
Mm.
said that, it just resonated so much with me and everything I told you about my
Yeah.
agnosticism.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
I knew I had to go back into the series and did not
Mm.
regret it.
That's great. I mean, there's something really like um, when you can exist in the place between your experience of a thing and the way a thing really exists, in that gap between, that's like a really kind of pregnant place, right? That's a creative place.
Mm.
And this, I mean, this goes back to my study of religion, and J.Z. Smith especially was big on talking about um, the difference between the map is not territory, right? This idea that the way we perceive things and the way things really are can never be the same. And as someone who's doing anthropological work, the way you describe something is never going to be the thing you're describing. There's always going to be a distance between those two. And for me, who's trying to understand the world, I think what's more interesting is to live in that space between, like in that gap between perspective or perspective and reality, because that's a place where new things can grow and new ideas can emerge. And that is this place of uncertainty. I know the idea of like liminality is really popular these days. I see it popping up all over the place. And this is like things I wrote essays about like 15, 20 years ago. So it's interesting to me because in religious studies is something we've talked about for a long time, right? Liminal events. Limen is the Latin word for a threshold, right? And so a liminal event is when you're crossing from one place to another. And so we talk about rituals and activities as liminal events. They're acts of transformation, right? They're places that are neither here nor there, but they're fecund because they are the source of transformation of some sort. And so some like very common things is like a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah is an experience or ritual experience that's talking about transformation from childhood to adulthood, right? But so liminality, I think, is something that I've been interested in for decades, and now it's become very popular. It's like a very popular term, but it's this idea that you're neither here nor there, but somewhere in the middle. And that place in the middle is a place of unknowing. It's a place that's not full of certainty. But due to that, there's no fixed edges. And without that fixed edge, new things can grow and new things can emerge, right? So there's a pregnant creativity that can only exist when you are neither here nor there, right? I think that's a really powerful idea.
It is a powerful idea. I love that. Excellent. I have so many other questions, and I'm trying to figure out where I should go from here. I'm curious, I guess, just to expand on what we were talking about before, with series and your exploration with that and the Eden trilogy, Philip. I was listening to a really interesting interview the other day with the author V.E. Schwab. I've never read anything by V.E. Schwab, by the way. I know that she's most known for her YA books, and I think
Mm-hmm.
The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. That's of her books, which I have an ebook of that I never read, but I listened to a fantastic interview. And by the way, she's a really extraordinary author in the sense that she read a lot of fantasy, and as a lesbian, she found that she was not seen in the fantasy books that she read about,
Mm-hmm.
like as a character, as that representation was really important to her. So I wanted to bring that up, especially because I know that Lecton, you did a fantastic video
Hmm.
recently on queer inclusion or erasure. So I want to get to that in a little bit. But I also want to ask Philip because I listened to that interview and I thought this was really interesting. She said in that interview that every story you tell would be a different story if you told it at any other point than right now. So that
Hmm.
at any point, like if you were to rewrite the Eden trilogy today, do you think it would be a different story? Or how is that for you? Because I know you wrote it over so many years. Do you think that story transformed for you as you wrote it and you went through different life events and different perspectives in life? Or do you think it probably would have been the same story if you had finished it 18 years ago than finishing it recently?
Oh my goodness, yeah. So yeah, I have no doubt that it would be a very different story if I wrote it today in some respects, and in others probably there would be some broad similarities. But the story did change over the almost 2 decades that I was tinkering with it and making it better. I would not want anyone to see my first efforts. But it grew as I think my understanding of what I was doing was growing. And it's funny because I think of myself as a very planned person. I'm definitely more on the architect side of the spectrum when it comes to writing, not the gardener side. So I had an outline, I made a map, I created the world, I had all this stuff. And yet in the process of writing, I often felt the story pulling me and saying, no, you need to do this. And I did my best to listen. And so it changed. The story, somehow the act of creating itself put me in a place where I felt the story was telling me to do things, and I was listening. It was a dialogue that I was in between me and the story. And I couldn't have done that if I had said, nope, I have an outline, I'm going to stick to it, I'm going to be rigid about this, and I know exactly what I'm doing. So I had to have a little bit of humility sometimes in order to say to myself, oh, wait, no, the story is trying to tell me something here, and I need to be in tune with that. So it changed as I wrote, and also as I read other things. I think maybe a lot of people have noted there's a difference between book 3 and books 1 and 2. And I wrote books 1 and 2 primarily in my 30s, and I wrote book 3 in my 40s, and now I'm in my 50s. So who knows what I would do? But other factors there, not only just the aging and the slightly different perspective on life. I think also I read other things. Like I think to me anyway, I don't know if anyone reading it would agree, but I actually do know some people would say so because I've seen them say it. But I read Malazan between books 1 and 2 and book 3. So I can't say there's a lot of Malazan influence on the first 2 books, but on the third book, I felt that reading Malazan actually freed my imagination. Joanna, you know how I've remarked in the past how as a child, I felt that Tolkien baptized my imagination, but that Stephen Erickson as an adult for me really freed my imagination. And I realized, oh, wow, fantasy can do this. Oh, I didn't realize that, and so off I go trying to do this, in Return to Adan, book 3. And so maybe there's a difference there. So yeah, I think people do evolve, people change, and it's like the old adage about never being able to step in the same river, twice, so I do think that it would be a different thing. So.
That also goes for reading though, as well.
Yeah.
Like when
Oh
you
my
pick
goodness.
up a text over years, right? It's the same thing.
It's true.
And I know for me, like I actually wrote my master's thesis on something like this, which is I talked about this idea that I called textual intimacy, which I have a friend who's a bishop in the Celtic Orthodox faith, and he introduced me to something from the Christian faith, which is the exact same thing I was talking about. So it would have been nice if he talked to me before I wrote my thesis. But the idea of it was that we often look at texts, whether they're religious text or fiction, whatever it is, as like fixed things, right? That they have a meaning. And then I'm going to engage in this text and find the meaning. And then I'll know what this means. And I think that's a really limiting way to engage with any text, whether it be fiction or religious or whatever it may be. But instead, if you have an open mind when you experience it and you say, I'm developing a relationship with this text, and every time I'm bringing myself to the text and whatever I am today, and I'm going to find something new in that text. So you can read the same thing. In my thesis, I was talking about engaging in religious material and like prayers that you recite every day, and how you can recite that same prayer every day and every day have a new meaning from it, because the prayer itself isn't limited. It's due to your relationship with it. And it's the same for fiction, 100%. And anytime you've reread a story that you read first when you were a child, and then you read again as like a young adult, and then, as you're getting older, there's totally different experiences, right? And so I think that part of that change, as you're saying, reading is a creative process, right? And that comes with, it's not just the writing process, but like what I bring to a story is really powerful.
Yes.
Beautifully said.
I love that. We were talking about that last night on my friend Jimmy's channel on the Fantasy Network, because he and our friend Murphy and I, Buddy, read a book together by Ishiguro called Clara and the Sun. And Ishiguro leaves a lot to your imagination. He does not over-explain
That's
anything.
definitely myth-making. Clara and the Sun is 100% myth-making. Oh my goodness.
Have you read it?
Yeah, I read it when it came out. Yeah.
Oh, that's right. I think you did tell me that.
Clara's
I love
response,
that book.
right? The way she like creates. Anyway, yeah. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you're fine. Yeah, we all three of us loved the book. But what was amazing about it is while we were reading it alongside each other, we would talk through it because we read it like 20 to 30 pages a day and then talk about it every day. And
Mm.
every time we talk about a section of the book, Jimmy would have one idea about what was going on. I would have a totally different understanding of what was going on. Murphy would have a totally different idea of what was going on. And in our heads, we just assumed that everybody was thinking about it the same way as until
Yeah.
we talk about it and realize, oh, wow, we're all looking at this in a
Yeah.
totally different way. And it just added to the wonder of what Ishiguro was doing on the page to add so much
Hmm.
wonder and curiosity and just the way that we as readers fill in the blanks without even realizing we're doing it. So I don't know. That's what made me think about
Yeah,
that.
because we take ourselves to the stories, right? We take
Mhm.
ourselves into our process. And so,
Mhm.
of course, what is important to me and what is meaningful to me is going to be not necessarily the same as what's important to you. And
Yep.
so, of course, that's how art works, right? Like not just literature. Any great art is able to evoke a relationship with the person engaging in that art. And that's the powerful aspect of it, right? Is that
Yes.
my relationship and yours aren't going to be the same, but the art itself is some sort of common locus where we can feel something and learn
Yes.
something.
It's a common locus, and at the same time, there is the creativity to that,
Mm.
to our constructing a story world in our experience. Yeah. Lectin, I wanted to ask you though about your wonderful video that you just recently
Mm.
did on queer inclusion or erasure. For those people who haven't watched it, I highly recommend checking it out. Do you want to talk about your experience or just summarize a little bit about the video?
Yeah. Um, so these days you read a lot of. So obviously, I'll start by saying that I think any author can write any kind of character if they put the work in and they have an open mind and their open heart and they do it sincerely. And so I'd have no problem with straight presenting authors, including queer characters. I think they need to. I think it's important, you know? But I've read a number of stories recently where there are queer characters that are included, and it just feels like they're putting a label on it, but that their identity, whatever it may be, doesn't actually inform the character in any meaningful way. It just is like, oh, look, now I have this, I have a bisexual character, I have an asexual character, I have a trans character. And there's one book specifically that just kind of, I'm not going to mention it because I don't need to trash anything, but it was like infuriating that like these are just thrown away titles that didn't have anything to do with the plot or the character. It's like, oh, by the way, I'm this, and then you move on. And so just the idea of including queer characters isn't the same thing as queer inclusion, right? And that goes for any kind of marginalized or oppressed identity. My experience here in this context being having to do with queer characters, but it's the same for any marginalized or underrepresented community or identity. That just putting them in your story isn't the same as including them, right? To include them, you have to do some effort to make what is uncommon about them be part of who they are as a character, right? So that's one aspect I was going at, is that I think just including or having a queer character isn't the same as queer inclusion. So that's something I've been thinking about a lot because I read a lot of books written by queer authors or books that are labeled like queer fiction, and sometimes they're and so like a great example of that I gave in my video is that Jeff Vandermeer's trilogy, he's not a queer author, but he has a queer character in his second and third book, and it's a very minor part of that character. He just kind of mentions it in passing, but that one detail changes your whole perspective of understanding how that character exists in the world and the struggles they go through and what it means to be. In the second book, there's the associate director who's a woman who you find out that she was married and has a son, and she didn't come out until her son went away to college. And all of a sudden, she got divorced and now has a girlfriend. So from that one little fact, you can learn a whole lot about that character and how she goes about engaging with all the characters around her. So that's something that's inclusion. Like her identity as a queer person changed something about how she lived in that world. And he didn't have to beat a dead horse with it. It's just mentioned in passing. So that is like a type of queer inclusion I think is useful, as opposed to just like labeling a character and it feels very trite.
Mm.
So in a lot of the books I've been reading recently, I just finished a book today. Well, then that goes into the next point, this idea of queer erasure. A lot of fantasy and sci-fi that are set in like these idyllic worlds they'll have characters that are engaging in relationships that we would identify as queer right now, whether they be same-sex relationships or third gender identities and things like this, but they're not clocked at all in these worlds. And so on one hand, this is like gay utopia, right? Like everyone, like there's no discrimination based on who you are or how you are, or how you present yourself, which is wonderful. But at the same time, by doing that, you have this kind of erasure of queer identity because of all the struggles that people are actually experiencing in the world right now. You just totally ignore them. And so it's kind of like a white person saying, well, I don't see race, right?
Mhm.
It gives me that experience sometimes when I read a story where it is this world where you have what look like queer relationships, but they aren't clocked in any way. And it's a hard thing for me to talk about or to think about because I want to live in that idealized world, right? I want to live in a world where our differences are what make us powerful as a community and they're celebrated and there is no discrimination based on that. I want to live in a world rather where like you don't have to call out that this person has two fathers or two mothers or whatever because it's not a thing, right? And so I support creating worlds that look like that. But if you're going to do that, you should find some way that that difference is celebrated as part of the world. And that is part of the beauty of that world, right? It's not just a thing that just happens that you don't mention. And like I just finished a story today that is a decent story, but like there's one character that uses they them pronouns, but they don't really ever explain why. This character does. And there's a character who just had a baby and she talks about her past relationship with a man, but now she's attracted to a woman. But there's no conversation about what that means in this world. It just is like very natural. And on one hand, I'm like, great, that's natural. It should be natural. Like, we shouldn't have to have conversations about it. But by eliminating those conversations at this point in time in the 21st century, like, there are whole communities of people whose voices you are silencing and saying, like, your suffering, your struggle, your experiences aren't valid, right? And so it can feel that way. I'm not saying authors do that intentionally, but that's what I think is intention matters. And so if you're going to, when you include characters that aren't from the community you represent, and if you're creating a world where that difference is erased, you have to do so in a way that is intentional and thoughtful. And if you can do that, then then that's the goal, right? To do it in a thoughtful and intentional way. And I'm always willing to give someone the benefit of the doubt. Like I'm not, and I think most readers, well, I don't know about that, but I like to believe most readers are willing to give you the benefit of the doubt. They don't expect things to be perfect. But if you do something in a thoughtful and intentional way, then that is what's most meaningful. But that line between inclusion and erasure, I think, can be a really a razor's edge sometimes. You know, if you're just checking off boxes because you feel like that's the right thing to do, and even if you genuinely feel that, but then I read it and I feel like, well, you're just checking off boxes. You don't really care about representing members of this community. That sours me a little bit, you know? So that was kind of what I was looking at.
No, I really appreciated your perspective on all of that. And especially because I know that you're not discouraging people who are not queer, not to write.
No, I'm encouraging it. I'm encouraging it. I'm just doing it in a thoughtful way, you know, and being intentional with it and not just saying, well, I'm going to do this because it's the hip thing to do to have, you know, queer characters. Therefore, I'm going to do it. It's more like look around the world. I guarantee that you know people that are queer, whether you know them or not. You know what I mean? Especially in America right now and with Gen Z, especially being much more open about their identities and having less strictures and like, you know, just ideas put on them and forced on them. They're much open and freer with how they understand themselves, that you know queer people. And it doesn't take a lot of work to be thoughtful and intentional and do a little bit of work when you include them in your story. Right? Like, it's not hard. These days, there's so much material, right? So I want that to happen. I think part of it too, I was talking to my sister about it recently, because earlier in the year, I just read a number of books back to back that all had queer characters. And then all of a sudden, I read 2 or 3 books that didn't have queer characters. And I was like, why aren't there any queer characters in these? Like, I don't understand. Like, it's so easy to include them. Do you know what I mean? Like, I just had, like, I don't get it.
Wow.
And, but my sister pointed out, though, is that, like, I talk a lot about Richard K. Morgan's series, A Land Fit for Heroes. Do you know this?
I just heard you talk about it recently, and I didn't realize it had that representation in it. So
well, it does, and so it's a dark, like really dark, grimdark kind of fantasy series. And he wrote it like more than a decade ago. I think 2008 maybe is when the first one came out. And the main character is queer or gay, and there's like a gay sex scene in one of the books. And I remember an interview with him, and he's a straight guy, he's married, a cishet white guy, and they were like, "Oh, you did such a convincing like queer sex scene. How'd you do that?" And he's like, "Well, I know how sex works, and I know how the emotions of sex work. It doesn't like the bodies weren't that important, right?" So he got a lot of like praise for it. And I was talking to my sister about it. And she was like, yeah, but you know, writing a sex scene is easy compared to representing a queer life outside of sex, which is the more difficult thing. And so she wasn't taking anything away from his story, but she's like, that's actually a lot easier. Trying to write a good representation of characters who have dissident or non-normative sexual identities or presentations without actually engaging in sexual activity in the book is actually more work, you know? And a lot of people just don't seem like I won't say a lot, but like not everyone's doing the work. And it's not hard to do.
Yeah.
You know, it's not hard to do.
Well, I
And
love
there's
this
so many
comment
people that would
here.
be willing to be beta readers as well. Like if you include characters that don't look like you, there's definitely beta readers and sensitivity readers who will read it and say like you've done a good job or not, you know?
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, I love this comment here. I'm going to highlight by N.A.
Mm.
Summer, who says that this has motivated me to take a closer look at some of my characters in world. I have some queer characters, but now I want to make sure there isn't any erasure happening. So I just think that's a wonderful influence that you have with that video. I think it's an important topic. And I guess like in my own small way, I think the way that I can slightly relate to it is, as a female reader, kind of like what V. Schwab was talking about a little bit, as a female reader of fantasy, a lot of times if you look at older fantasy, you
Mm-hmm.
might see women in fantasy. Like for example, in Lord of the Rings, you have three very incredible women, female characters, but they're highly idealized, and we don't get a lot of
Mm-hmm.
page time. We get
Yeah.
more of Arwen in the appendices
Yeah.
than we
Yeah.
do of her on the page. Of course, the movies changed that a bit, which is fine. But yeah, I remember growing up whenever I'd read, Lord of the Rings or Elric or Piers Anthony or whatever stories I was reading at the time. Just not, I remember enjoying it, but I didn't think about it that deeply. I just know that
Mm.
whenever I saw a female character on the page, I think, oh wow, a female character. I would get excited. And I
Yeah.
didn't really think about it too deeply because I just thought I love fantasy. I love fantasy.
Mm.
And it was years later when I read A Song of Ice and Fire that I got in-depth female characters, and they're not idealized. Like some of them are
Mm-hmm.
very flawed. Some of them make some horrible mistakes. And
Yeah.
I loved that though. I loved that
Yeah.
we got that exploration, like Cersei Lannister, who I adore. A lot of people know, and I love Cersei Lannister because she's a deeply flawed person, not because she's female. Of course, she's just
Mm-hmm.
she's deeply flawed in her thinking, but a lot of her conflicts do
Mm-hmm.
arise from the patriarchy in which she lives
Yeah.
in.
Well, that I
And
mean, I
I
think that's the important thing, right? Like representation clearly matters, like across the board. Like that's easy and really, really important. Representation matters. Seeing yourself in the fiction you consume or in the art you consume is wildly important. We know this looking at young kids of color in America and not being able to see themselves even in like TV shows
yes,
and what kind of detrimental effect that has on them because it stifles your imagination in many important ways. But as you pointed out, with Cersei Lannister is a perfect example. Some people think that to write a good female character, you just swap the gender. It's a male character, now you make them a female, and therefore it's good female representation. And that's not. It's a very similar thing what I'm talking about. It's just making that character female doesn't actually embrace anything about that character's about being female that is contributing to their character. So Cersei Lannister's problems or her experiences are very much defined by her being a woman in this patriarchal society. It's not just a male character that's been swapped with a female term. Her existence and her everything that's going on with her, all the positives and negatives, are deeply related to her experience as a woman in this world, right? So that's a really good.
yeah,
You can't just swap a gender. You have to do the work of this person is actually their gender or gender identity means something to their story, to their narrative. That's
yes.
what you mean. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I also have to agree with Talking Story here. More page time should be set aside for assassin elves. I agree. And thankfully, Philip did that in the Edom trilogy.
I mean, you got a lot of page time there,
I
Joanna.
did. He answered that. Yeah. I'll go ahead and highlight Nerdy Kathy's comment here. Tokenism and underrepresented groups is even worse than excluding them entirely, in my opinion. I totally agree with this.
Yeah.
I completely agree with this. I think some people avoid it altogether. It's like, oh, I don't want to be about tokenism. But
Yeah.
that's avoidance of that is worse. Like is worse than for sure.
Yeah, I mean,
We
some authors like they write characters that are kind of tokenized, and that's not their intent. And so there's a difference between actually having a token character that you're just doing to fill page count and to meet expectations, and not being sensitive enough to include a character in a meaningful way. And I think a great example of that is someone like Stephen King. And you read a lot of Stephen King's older work, and his black characters are pretty awful, like in a lot of his older work. And there's a lot of the magical Negro trope in some of his stories. And he's openly said, like, I'm doing my best. And you read throughout the stories, and he gets much better representation. He's still really bad at writing dialogue for, like, anyone that's not from the 50s. Like, any kid that didn't grow up in the 50s. Like, he writes dialogue for books that are set in the current day, but it's like teenagers. Not Stephen King's strong suit. But that's fine. Like, he's a 75-year-old man, so writing like teenage dialogue, you can give him a
Yeah.
pass.
I
But you
actually
see his
wanted to bring up
representation.
Stephen King here in a minute,
Oh.
but yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
But just his representation of black characters, especially, has improved monumentally, and he'll say that he's one of the first ones to say it. And he says, like, I was doing the best I can, but I was tokenizing them because my experiences were so limited, and I thought I was being inclusive and celebrating them, and I would do it differently, and so I do it differently in my new books, in my new work. And so I think being able to admit that, like, I did my best and it wasn't great, but I'm willing to do better and try to do better is important as well. But I agree, just tokenizing them and then like leaving it there and saying, no, I've included them. I'd rather you not include them if that's all you do, if you limit it to that.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, Philip, go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm kind of
I
left you out of this conversation.
Do you want me to respond to any of that?
Yeah, sure. If you have anything you want to respond to.
No, I mean, that sounds like a very important video, and I haven't watched it yet, but I will watch it. And it is something that I thought about as I was writing my book, and keeping in mind, I started the thing, 2 decades ago.
Yeah.
And I do have a world where I knew that queerness was not going to be something that was looked upon positively by the powers that be, that the authorities. Mm-hmm. This was a world where the dominant mindset was very much anti-queer. And so these are characters living in that kind of environment. And I have queer characters in the story. I have several of them, actually. And their queerness is something that I tried my best to make up just part of their characters in a meaningful way, that they exist in this world that is hostile to who they are, the core of who they are. And how does that play out in their story? And how does that affect them on a daily basis? That's something that I thought about and I tried my best to include as a part of the story. It's not central necessarily, but it is a part of certain characters who are very important in the story and are important to me. So yeah, I did my best with that. It was when you're writing any character who is different from yourself, it is an act of imagination to some degree, and you want to be sensitive and do your very best in that. So I hope I did justice to those characters. But yeah, I have important female characters. I have important queer characters, just like life. I tried to say to myself, you know what? I want to write books that reflect life, and this is part of life, everybody,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly.
I know exactly. I know of one character that's immediately come to mind. I'm kind of blanking, I think, on maybe some of the other ones, but
yeah, I can tell you afterwards, because it is. I mean, it is a little bit of a spoiler. Not really. I think if you're sensitive enough, you can figure out in the first book who there's a character there who is definitely gay, and then in the second book, it's very obvious. By the second book, it's very obvious, and then the third book, there's another character that's not as obvious, but it will be more obvious in the sequel that I'm writing right now.
Oh, neat. Okay. Yeah. And it was funny because I had this like thought in my head how you were talking about the books that you read are influencing what you're writing, and my mind went to, I wonder if One Piece is affecting your novella right now.
Oh my goodness, One Piece is I just read a part of One Piece that is very, very, I think, wonderful and in its celebration of queerness. And
Great.
Yeah, I mean, it's a cool thing to see that kind of representation. And it's not always, as many of my One Piece fans who write comments on my videos are telling me, it's not ideal. It's not always perfect, because we have differences in how we view it here in the West, as opposed to how Oda, being a Japanese man, there are differences for sure. But I'm told, as you get further and further into the series, that his representation of queerness, it gets even better. So I'm thinking, wow, that's great. That's fantastic.
Well, I was actually interested. I mean, I saw that you were reading One Piece, and so much of contemporary Western fantasy is basically based on like medieval Europe, right? Like medieval Europe is like the starting point, and that's what's built on. And you being a medievalist, haven't read your trilogy yet, but I'm guessing that's probably part of the world that was a starting point for it.
A big chunk of it, yeah.
And, I just finished reading Rebecca Roanhorse's Between Earth and Sky trilogy, which very much takes an anti-colonialist approach, where all of her communities are based on indigenous communities throughout the Americas and Mesoamerica, North America, and Canada. and the U.S. and Canada. And so she's using indigenous communities and cultures as the basis for her fantasy world, which I thought was phenomenal.
Yes.
And so taking a very anti-colonialist lens to the experience of fantasy. But so I was wondering, I mean, it's interesting now knowing you're writing an additional book to your trilogy. But anything you write in the future, I wonder how your experience of fantasy, so One Piece being Japanese fantasy, obviously isn't basing in the same world, how that changes your experience of like what world you want to create, you know? I know
Yeah.
obviously like the world you already created is somewhat fixed, like you're not going to create a whole new world for that trilogy, but just thinking about so much of our canon, the Western literary canon for fantasy is based on medieval Europe. And where can we go aside from that to create new worlds? You know?
Yeah, no, it's happening, and the genre is exploding in that
Mhm.
way, and I love it. It's fantastic. One Piece is actually incredibly eclectic. Like Oda
Mhm.
will very obviously nod to Dante's Inferno, and on the one hand, and then he'll do something like Journey to the West, you know, and then he's very all over the place with his allusions and what he includes in there.
Mhm.
But yeah, in my own particular case, I think traveling in South Asia, living in South Asia, had really did change the kind of fantasy that I wrote, because
Mhm.
otherwise it probably would have been simply Old English, Old Norse inspired, Western medieval society inspired. But having had that experience, that really is also just my own um, journey of understanding who I am in relation to people that I thought of maybe as being different, but realized, wow, actually, there's so many things I have to learn from these people and so many ways in
Mhm.
which I see myself reflected in them. And it was such a beautiful experience for me that became central to my story as well.
Mhm.
And a lot of the culture that's represented, the language in one case is very much based on Nepali, which I speak terribly, but I was able to kind of fake fake a language in there, which is
Mhm.
very South Asian, and so yeah, there are other influences in there as well, and I
Mhm.
can thank the fact that I had this opportunity to live in a place
Mhm.
that changed me, and changed the way I think of the world, and that's a big part of what I'm trying to explore as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, then
I
the beauty of that is then putting that in a story for someone who hasn't had that experience
Yep.
can then engage in a world that is a fantastical world that doesn't just look like medieval Europe. And again, there's nothing wrong with those stories, right? Like I'm not bashing that at all, but just
Right.
being able to take your experiences, which are more diverse, and say and create this world, then you open that up to so many people who may not have the experience or opportunity to travel, who may not have the experience to do with anything to do with South Asian culture or religion. And so
Yeah.
just putting a flavor of that in, I think is really, really, really wonderful. You know, it's a gift if you can do it well. You know, not just you, but I mean in general. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and it's also interesting because you were talking about Dante's Inferno having an influence on One Piece.
Oh
So it
yeah.
sounds like there are Western influences in One Piece, whereas
Hmm.
yeah,
Big
I
time.
find that interesting.
Oh,
And
he
at the same
he's
time,
he goes all over the world, and the
I
fandom of One
see.
Piece is the most international fandom I've ever come across.
Hmm.
You make me wanna read One Piece so badly, not
Yeah.
necessarily because I know it's very popular on YouTube, I wouldn't necessarily even wanna watch it necessarily to engage on it in my channel necessarily, maybe, but I'm more interested in reading One Piece just so I could have a conversation with you. Just so I could, like, join the fun, you know?
Well, and there's Murphy and Jimmy and
Yes.
Alan, and yeah.
I feel left out, but
Yeah.
but someday I probably will get to it. It sounds like a lot of fun. I love that. I'm recently watching the adaptation of Uzumaki by Junji
Hmm.
Ito. I read the manga a few years ago on Halloween, and it was interesting because I watched an excellent analysis of it in which somebody was comparing it to Dante's Inferno. And when they said that, like I haven't read Dante's Inferno, I'm still ill read, but I felt like I could see what I know of Dante's Inferno. I could see the influence. I could see also like Kirk Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. I could see a little bit of that influence in it. So it's
Hmm.
interesting how manga can take or influences like other types of uh,
Mm.
books from other types of cultures or other places in the world can take influences from other places. I just find that
Hmm.
really interesting. And then it influences us. Just an interesting circle.
I think it's definitely a new trend in Western literature and art to be influenced by things outside of the West. But we've had this kind of imperialist mindset that we are like the epitome of like
Mm.
culture and ideal for a long time that we haven't looked outside of ourselves, whereas other cultures have often had to, right? Because you have these other dominant forces in
Mm.
the marketplace of ideas, which they may or may not agree with, but they can't avoid being exposed to them, right? Like you can't avoid being exposed to American culture when even if you don't live in America. Like it's unavoidable. Whether you like it or hate it, you're going to be exposed to it. Whereas in America, it's very easy to avoid being exposed to cultures outside of our own. Never mind American culture, like our very regional, distinct culture. You can isolate yourself if you want to, and it's just easier to. So it's only recently, I'd say in the last couple of decades, that we really see more exposure, like willingly exposure to experiences outside of our own bubbles.
Mm.
And other countries and other cultures have been forced to do that, whereas we haven't been forced to. But now that we are doing more of it, I think it's only benefiting everyone,
Oh,
you know?
yes, I completely agree. I had the pleasure of reading Ken Liu, and Ken Liu is American, but
Mm.
I read the Paper Menagerie short story collection over the summer, and Philip and I are planning to read the Dandelion Dynasty together, I believe. And I just love the way that he integrates Asian cultural influences in his stories, and he intersects the two, Western and
Mm-hmm.
Asian cultural influence, and looks at the collective cultural mindset versus the individualist cultural
Mm.
mindset and how those two intersect, how those two can be at odds or in conflict with one another. It's just one of my favorite explorations, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that the genre is only all the richer for being able to bring those other influences into it for sure.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I love watching your discovery, Philip. I love watching your discovery of One
Mm-hmm.
Piece and just how excited it's made you, how it's opened a doorway for you that maybe you wouldn't have explored, I'm imagining, if it weren't for BookTube,
Oh,
possibly.
for
So,
sure. Yeah, there are
yeah.
so many great things I've read because of being part of this community, and that's at the forefront at this point. Yeah, I would never have probably. Although to be fair to myself, I grew up on comic books, so I loved them. I absolutely
Mhm.
loved them, and so I don't think I ever felt, snobby about it or anything like that. It's just, would it have occurred to me to try manga? Probably not if it
Mm.
hadn't been for, being part of this community and hearing people talk about it and eventually reading some manga along with Murphy and eventually deciding, I'll just try this One Piece thing. It looks goofy and fun and and it's turned out to be incredibly deep and emotional as well. So,
Mm.
Yes, yes. I as for me, and a departure a little outside of my comfort zone, I just yesterday finished a book that I've heard you talk about, Lectin. I believe you talked about this book on your channel, and that is It by
Oh,
Stephen
yeah.
King. And wow, this is a long book, by the way. It took me a very
Yeah.
long time to read it. Uh, read it. It's just hard the word. I have a lot of thoughts about this book, which I'll be talking about on my channel. But I think Stephen King is a fascinating writer, and I actually think a lot of fantasy readers would appreciate this book because Stephen King, if you like the found family trope,
Mm.
this young group of kids, this loser group of friends who come together and the loyalty that they form, the friendships that they form are really at the heart, I
Mm.
think, of what a lot of people love in fantasy. But there's a lot to that book for sure. And there's a lot
Yeah.
of really difficult content in that book too.
Yeah. Of
Like,
course, and the scene at the end in the sewers
oh,
is the big scene
awful.
that was never represented in any of the movies for good reason. I'm not,
Yes.
but I will say
I did not like that part. Sorry. Go ahead,
I've
Phil.
heard a lot of I thought about it a lot and heard a lot of commentary on it. So I think it's actually a really meaningful scene, and that
Ah,
it's not supposed to be comfortable. It's not supposed to be something that is being celebrated. And I'm being aloof, but you know what scene I'm talking about, and anyone that's read it knows that scene. Everyone, you know what I mean.
I'm so grateful
But
to hear your thoughts on this. Yes.
well, I've heard people talk about it more eloquently than I can. But I think a big part of what I love about it, I mean, I read it when I was very young, right? I started reading Stephen King when I was 10, and I shouldn't have been, but I did. And it was one of the first books I read, like in the first like half dozen or dozen books, and I was so proud to read a book that was that big. It was like a source of pride for me, and I've read it I think 3 or 4 times since then.
Wait, how old were you when you first read it?
I would have been 10 or 11,
Yeah.
which is the age of the Losers Club, right? Which is
So
a big
true.
deal, right?
Yeah.
When you think about like as an adult reading that scene is like hard. But if you think of what those kids were and their experience, for them at that point in the book, what was keeping them together as a unit, um, being together as a unit was what was keeping them to survive, like being a family. And now that they'd achieved their goal of, defeating Pennywise, they were falling apart. And they didn't have the emotional strength to continue as a unit that would allow them to finish their quest, as it would be. And that was like in the 11-year-old brain, like that was what you had to do to keep that unity together. Whether it was the best decision or not, I don't know. But like it wasn't for no reason. You know what I mean? It had to do with kind of cementing their idea of what it means to be a family again, and to not lose something. But again, it's a controversial scene. More important in that book, I think, and what I really appreciate in that book is that the way he goes back and forth between the children's narratives and the adult narratives, and you see the experiences of childhood affect them as adults, and that's something I think a lot of the films have failed to do, because most of the films, especially the newest one, which I enjoyed, but the first movie was focused mostly on the kids, and the second movie was focused mostly on the adults. And you lose the relationship between what happened as a kid and what happened as an adult, and how that affects you. Where in the book, you go back and forth, right? Like you see a scene with the kids, and then you see a scene with the adults. And you can see right away how their experience as children totally shapes their experience as adults, and how they're repeating the same behaviors, or they get stuck in the same loops, or how they're avoiding certain things. And that is one of the things I think King does really well, is like show that relationship between like your childhood trauma and experience and how that shapes you as an adult. And then to think that you've overcome this hugely traumatic experience only to have to face it again. And like so traumatic that you've put it out of your mind, like you don't actually physically remember it. And now all of a sudden it comes back with a vengeance, and how that can mess you up, basically. I think King does a really beautiful job of showing that in that book.
Yes. Yes, because each character in here has their own defenses. They have their own defenses and their own afflictions, at the same time as some of those afflictions are what make them endearing, I think, even to one another. It's a really interesting thing that he does with the characters in that book. But I was just curious. I was curious, though, because I was talking about this with my friend Jimmy last night, because he also read this book when he was around 11 years old. And my husband picked this book up when he was 11 years old. He DNF'd it because he found it, I think, a little complex for him at that age. But I'm just kind of shocked about how many men I've known who picked up Stephen King around that age. And I didn't, but wow.
A big part of it, I think.
By the way, did you pick up Stephen? Oh, you haven't, right? You picked.
I've only read Dark Tower, and I read that as an adult,
which is phenomenal. It's
yeah.
Such an
I loved
series,
it.
You know what I mean?
Love Dark Tower.
I thought it was really, really phenomenal, and it shows Stephen King actually has an ability to move within genre, right? Like there's some romance, there's some history, there's some romance, there's some Western, there's definitely fantasy, there's sci-fi, there's straight horror. Like I think he The Tower covers all, right? Like it's really a phenomenal series. I think a big thing with Stephen King, I listened to a Stephen King podcast, a couple of fan podcasts, and you hear people's Stephen King origin stories, and quite often it's those paperbacks with really attractive covers your parents are reading it, and they're on the bookshelf. And so like kids 10, 11, 12 are attracted to those early mass market paperback covers. Like that's one of the big things. And so a lot of people start reading it when they're young because their parents were, and they just get drawn to it, because the covers are so compelling. It wasn't quite my story, but I think that's why a lot of people read it, And then when you're that age, you see a book like It. I don't know, like when the first version of It I got from the library, and it was a hardcover, and it was like literally a doorstop. Like it's over 1,000 pages, it's like this big, it's huge, and like the sense of satisfaction of reading that was like so important to me as a young reader. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But yeah, Stephen King was a huge part of my childhood. When I was 10, someone gave me Misery for the first time, and because they just knew I was a good reader, and I was like out reading all the stuff they gave me. I was reading all of the Goosebumps book as a child from the 90s. I was big on R.L. Stein and then all of that, and I'd read 2 or 3 of them a week. So someone just was like, "Here, read Misery," and like Misery is not a book for a 10-year-old. And then I read Gerald's Game, which is like very much not a book for a 10-year-old. It involves like sex games gone wrong, and a husband kind of like a husband basically handcuffs his wife to a bed, and
I saw
then
the movie adaptation.
proceeds to sexually assault her, and then dies, and then she like has conversations with his dead corpse as like dogs come in and eat it, and it's really, really awful. And I was 10, and I was like, this is great. So maybe a little bit of benign neglect.
So this is
on the part of the adults in my life, but
yeah. So this is the thing. I mean, I know of you. John from Talking Story here said he also read King when he was very young.
Oh,
Matt
A lot
here
of
said
us
that he
did.
also read it in middle school. I told you my friend Jimmy also read it when he was your age. My friend, my husband started it at least at that age. I had friends in high school who also read Stephen King when they were that age. And reading it now as an adult, specifically this book,
Yeah.
I I have a lot of conflicting feelings about it because on the one hand, all of you turned out really well, obviously. And it's also I think it says something that you at that age were able to read far above your level and appreciate, an adult book. Um, at the same time, as an adult, I think if I had a son, I think we'd have to have some conversations.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Uh,
I've been trying to buy horror books for my niece and my nephew, my niece is 6 and my nephew's 9, and my other niece is only 1. And my sister's just like, no, no, like these are the like buy age appropriate books. And I'm like, fine, but here's a whole bookshelf of things that they can get to when they get a little bit older.
yeah. Yeah, it's just something I wonder about. I'm like, I'm not totally discouraging it, but I'm also questioning it as well. And my husband said, "Oh, you don't get it. Like when you're that age, you don't really think about those things that deeply." So
Yeah, well, definitely when you're that young, you're not reading for the same things as an
yeah.
adult, right? So what you picked up on and what was like emotionally resonant and horrifying to you as a kid, you gloss over a lot of that and you just go for like the more exciting things, right? Like that kind of thing definitely happens. I recently, maybe not this, was it 2022? I decided to be like a King completionist. So I went through all the books that I hadn't read or the books that I'd read but not remembered and reread all of them. And now, so I've read every Stephen King book except for 2 of his like hard-boiled detective books. I haven't read those yet, but I've read everything else. And some of them I did reread because I didn't remember them very well. And like rereading them and just having the recollections of them from being a young person and now, like it's wildly different because Stephen King's books are dense, you know? And as you were talking about, Philip, when you're writing, you let the story take you. That's his whole modus operandi, is that
yeah.
like he starts with an idea of a story and then he goes where it's going to go, which is why he's famous for having like somewhat weak third acts sometimes because he doesn't plan it out. He just sees what's going to happen. And sometimes it's spectacular and sometimes you're like, okay.
Mm.
You know, like that's he's famous for it because that's like his way of going. But sometimes you get really phenomenal things. Like for instance, in the Bill Hodges trilogy, which is a trilogy of detective stories that also mix with supernatural. He introduced his character Holly Gibney, who is like a 40-year-old in mid 40s woman who's probably on the autism spectrum, and she was like a ministerial assistant, and he just loved her, and he's written like 3 or 4 more books with her. Like one of his most recent books is just Holly. It's called Holly. It's all about her,
Mhm.
and she's got another one coming out that's like the end of her story. But he like didn't know anything about her when he started. But he's like, this person is amazing. I just need to write this person more. So he let the book take him where it was going to be, you know? And I think reading that, especially as a young age, you get that feeling that there's just something exciting and reckless about his writing. And I don't mean in a bad way, but just like,
Yes, I know
there's this,
exactly what
you
you
know what I
mean.
mean? Like there's
Mhm.
something reckless about it where it's just taking you where it has to take you. And I think that is just really appealing, you know?
I think
Yes.
the ending of Dark Tower is a great example.
Oh,
Obviously,
yeah.
we're not going to talk specifics here, but let's just say it's a little controversial. But
Yeah.
I thought it was absolutely brilliant. I
Yeah.
loved the ending to Dark Tower.
Hmm.
Just
Yeah,
fantastic.
me too. I think it
Yeah.
ended the exact way it had to,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
not everyone agrees, but I think it was perfect. Yeah, yeah.
I had some mixed feelings, but I overall am positive on the Dark Tower
Yeah.
series. But yeah, so Philip, I know that you did not read King at a young age, and
No,
you have daughters, and your daughters did read way above their level at a young age. Was
yeah.
there any way that you were like, did you feel like you ever had to that they ever read any material? I guess they didn't really read any material though that you felt you had to have conversations about, or
No, I mean, they were naturally curious. So, in terms of fiction, I can't think of anything I mean, I read a lot with them, especially when they were really little. That was just a way we bonded with both daughters. So I never worried about the fiction. There was a certain age when they were naturally curious about things, and I never had an issue with the kinds of books, the nonfiction stuff they wanted to find out about at certain ages. And we would go to the library. I have wonderful memories of going to the library and leaving. I'd be holding a huge pile of books with me, and they're all for my little girl. And the librarian's looking at, well, you must read a lot, and yeah, we'll be back. We'll be back in 2 days. Yeah, through all these.
Yeah.
So they were just naturally curious kids, and I can't recall ever having to say, no, I'm sorry, you're not ready for that book yet. Maybe I was just lucky, but yeah, I never felt like there was something that they were curious about that they shouldn't have the answers to, in a way that would not only feed their curiosity, but also let them know about some important aspects of life that people go through. So
yeah. No, I mean, I think it's important. I was fortunate reading them, and like they didn't obviously scar me in any way, but I don't think there's anything wrong with young children reading adult material if there are people to create context for it, right? And so if you're interested, if you have young children, I mean, I guess there are some lines in the sand, but children are interested in reading adult material, then as you're saying, you have conversations with them about it or read it along with them. I don't think you need to like stifle the creative impulse to engage in that material if you can just let them do it in a healthy way, But at the same time, this is a great example. So my nephew is 9, and he's not allowed to watch YouTube without his parents like overseeing what he watches. And the other day he went to visit his friend, and they watched like horror stories on YouTube. And he came and told my sister right away. He's like, we did this, and she's like, yeah, okay, it's fine. And then he wakes up in the middle of the night screaming because he's having nightmares.
Oh.
And she's like, well, now you see, like, there's a reason that we like to watch things with you. Like, we're not just creating arbitrary rules. Like, we understand like what your limits are. And so if you want to explore these things, there's a way to do it that's not going to have you wake up all night long with nightmares, right? So part of being in like responsible relationships, and obviously I don't have children, I never will. I'm an uncle. I'm very happy being an uncle. But I think engaging with young people is that like young people know a lot more than we give them credit for. And saying you're not allowed to do this or creating walls is damaging, or it can be. So instead you have to find a way to hold their hand through that material. And that's what I think is, most beneficial, in general.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Though I'm speaking out of turn as, someone who does not have children and never will. So I can appreciate that my
that's okay, same here.
Doesn't need to be prioritized in this conversation.
Well,
yeah, I don't have children either, but I'm just curious.
Being an uncle or an aunt, you think about these things naturally as well, I think. So, yeah.
Yes.
And you get to walk away afterwards,
Yeah.
It's true. It's true. And I mean, it's
not
really
me.
interesting because it's just every kid is different. I feel like every kid is very different when it comes to this type of thing. Like, for example, my nephew is, well, he's grown a bit older, so I don't know where he's at now as far as this is concerned, but I know my sister, she said to me like that he gets scared so easily that, that maybe Stephen King would be way too scary for him. Whereas, another younger boy, it might not be the same case. I mean, it could just be different across different.
Though, and also like, I will say, if you have young kids who are interested in Stephen King, but you're worried about them being a little afraid, there are like Stephen King stories that are less scary. And like a perfect example is Eyes of the Dragon, which is like a young adult fantasy story. And it's like pure fantasy. It actually kind of ties in. You could argue it ties into the Dark Tower. Like it has characters, Randall Flagg kind of characters that may or may not overlap with Dark Tower. But yeah, it's so there are Stephen King stories that you could say, okay, like here's a way to like ease your way in,
Yeah.
So you
I
can
think
do
Fairy
things like
Tale.
that too.
I want to say Fairy Tale was fairly safe, if I can remember correctly.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was also a chunker. It was quite big, and it was kind of boring in places. I can imagine reading it as a kid,
I
just being
agree.
like, okay.
Didn't he actually write Eye of the Dragon for his daughter? Or did I
I think so.
Oh,
I believe so. I think so. But so I mean, I think Stephen King especially does kids well, which is interesting. I mean, Carrie, right, was his first published book, which is like such an interesting exploration of like what it means to be a young woman. And he wrote it, and then he didn't know if he should write it, and he originally threw it away. And Tabitha, his wife, took it out of the garbage and was like, no, this is like, you have something here. Like, that's the reason it was published, is because of his wife. He originally had written it and then was like, I don't know if I should be writing about this. And his wife was like, no, you should. This is something. And like, that was his first published novel. But it's such an exploration of what it means to be a young ostracized kid, a young woman who's going through changes, doesn't know how to navigate them. And then the results are not, good for anyone because of she's not given the guidance that she needs, right?
yeah. That was something I really loved about it. It actually brought me back to my childhood in so many ways And I
Hmm.
feel like King, he does not underestimate kids. He does
Yeah.
not underestimate kids and their intelligence, their
Hmm.
resilience, and also how harmful and dangerous they can be at times as well. I was reading this and I was thinking about like how unsafe some of these kids feel at times, even around other kids. And a lot of
Hmm.
people don't think about that. They think, oh, kids will be kids. If they're all with each other, they'll be safe. But he even has a whole passage about that, like how people
Yeah.
might look the other way and not realize a bully can be quite a dangerous thing.
Yeah.
So I felt like I could see that. I have nothing but a well,
But
I
even
mean,
in
I
that
was
story, like you look
critical.
at Henry Boyle's like his childhood, like and the way his father treats him, like you can see why he's a bully, like where he comes
Yeah.
from. The main bully in that
Yes.
story,
Yes.
right? Like
Mhm.
you
He
can
does.
see what this generational violence and trauma is, and he only has these other smaller kids to like enact his, his own trauma on. So like
Yes.
King does a good job of that, I think.
No, I
And I
agree. I
think
agree.
again, going to this whole idea of like reading as a way of understanding the world around you, I think something like King, especially, or it especially, it gives you a chance to see kind of cause and effect in some way, and you see how like small things you do in the world have bigger effects. You know what I mean? And so it gives you a way to understand through lines in your life in some way. Maybe it's like a blunt force instrument doing it. He's not very subtle in some things, but I think he does a good job of showing you like this is a world where things have consequences. And so by engaging in that and thinking about it, you can see, well, like what in my childhood led to me being the way I am now. Like what are my experiences that would lead me to be the way I am, and the way I approach things now, or the way I exist in the world. Like what experiences in my life led me to that, and he does a good job of mirroring that in a story like that. So like that gives it's not just like a scandalous or kind of like transgressive novel. It's a chance to actually reflect on your own childhood and how that childhood created who you are.
Yeah. Sorry,
Yes.
like, and Joe and I were both laughing at Alan in the comments. We
For
could see us break out in a smile as you were talking. It was because Alan.
sorry.
Well, you're going to have a chance to vent about that, Alan, on Tuesday, I believe,
Yes,
right?
that's right.
Yeah.
I'm working on my thumbnail right now, but yes, Alan, just a little announcement here. Alan and I are going to be live on my channel on Tuesday night for the BookTube betrayal tag, and
Oh.
certain people might be tagged in that tag, but anybody who wants to do it could do it. So yeah, because everybody knows that that's Alan's buzzword right now is betrayal. Yeah. No, that's so well said though about what King does, how he portrays that experience so well.
Hmm.
I'm just yeah, I'm thank you all for the hype about that. A lot of people are excited about that. Yeah, I'm a fan. I mean, even though I'm still not sure that I needed that scene at the end. So Philip, there's a very controversial scene that happens at the end of it. And I
Uh-huh.
was prepared. I was prepared because everybody talks about it. And I didn't know what it was though exactly. And then I read it and I thought, okay, why did
Yeah.
we okay. And I did
Yeah, I
try
don't
to
think it was
understand.
necessary. I don't think it was necessary, but I
No.
don't think it was superfluous, and I don't think it was exploitative either. You know what I mean?
Mm,
And so I
yeah.
can see the rationale behind him including it. And I also realize he wrote that book like in the 70s. And like if he wrote it now, I do not think that scene would be there.
It was in the
He'd find a
80s.
different it was the 80s. He'd
Hmm.
find a different way to convey that the import of that scene. He could find a different way to convey it if he wrote it now. But like when he I don't think it was as controversial when he wrote it as it is to contemporary readers.
Oh,
You know,
really? Yeah, it
I
says
don't
here
think
he
so.
started it in 1981 and he finished it in 1985.
Jeez,
Yeah.
it's a
Wow.
big book.
But it's interesting because I'm usually I usually try so hard to say that they should have cut this out or this wasn't
Hmm.
needed in the story. I try to avoid statements like that because I
Hmm.
think there can almost always be a case for something being in a story, even if it doesn't quote unquote contribute to the plot. But in this case, like I did have a question mark. I wasn't really sure how I felt about it. But and I did feel as though he stretched the it metaphor maybe a little
Mm.
more than I would prefer regarding
Hmm.
that. But at the same time, like the rest of the book was really, I had a lot of appreciation for what he did uh,
Hmm.
with certain aspects of it. Probably more so the friendships and the children and the bullying, more so all those aspects than the horror itself. Though I
Yeah.
did appreciate the
No.
horror. Um, yeah.
I think that's why his horror works so well. It's because that often isn't the forefront of his story. It's
Yeah.
often the emotional relationships between characters that is the forefront of his stories. That's what he's interested in his character, and
Yeah.
which is why he can get lost with like third acts because he doesn't really care about the plot. He cares about the characters,
Yeah.
and so the horror is like a backseat to these emotional relationships, which is why I
Yeah.
think that they resonate for so many people. Is that that's what's more important to him, you know?
Yeah.
And like I'll read um any Stephen King book I read, it feels like I am like it's comfortable. And even if I know it's not a good book, like even if I'm like, okay, like this part can be cut out. A lot of his books, like they can have parts cut out. Like he writes more than he needs in his books. Like you know, not all
Yeah.
of them, but a lot of them. You're like, okay, it's like what 1,000, 1,100 pages. Like, okay, there are things that don't need to be there, just like plot wise.
Yeah.
But I just feel comfortable reading it because the relationships he creates and my experience of them is like so comfortable and something I'm used to that you know when you're reading a Stephen King book and you just fall into it, you know,
Yeah.
even his newer books.
Great stories transcend genre often like
Yeah.
that, and the
Yeah.
Yeah.
fact that for me, I love Malazan Book of the Fallen as just literature. I love Realm of the
Mm-hmm.
Elderlings as literature. The fact that they're fantasy is really secondary to
Yeah.
the beauty of those stories. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that you have to agree with you on that one. Yeah.
I
Yeah. I don't.
agree too. I mean, I
Mhm.
like, for example, I know Abercrombie. I'll come up with a couple of fantasy authors like Joe Abercrombie and Guy
Mhm.
Gabriel Kay. They have magic in their stories, but I would say that the magic is not necessarily the forefront of the story as
Mhm.
much as other
Mhm.
aspects of the story, like maybe societal themes or cultural themes. Usually, there are a lot of deep human themes that are being explored, especially in Kay's works, I would say, and I don't know. Would you agree with that, Philip, with Abercrombie as well? Do you feel like the fantasy elements aren't necessarily at the forefront?
Abercrombie's not that interested in magic, I think,
Yeah.
Mhm.
and certainly not very interested in world building. But he is very interested in human psychology, and
Mhm.
he's
Yes.
very perceptive when it comes to human psychology. So
Yeah.
yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's still
Yeah.
worthwhile reading, and yes,
I think this division of like genre versus literary fiction is not a useful division. You know what I mean? I
Mhm.
think it's a marketing decision, and because of that, we often look down on genre. No, we, but like people look down on genre fiction as being lesser than,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I think there's a movement now recognizing that their literary fiction is just you know a way of writing that transcends genre. So I've read genre work, horror and fantasy and sci-fi, that would fit into what you call literary fiction in the way it uses language, the way it deals with themes, the way it creates a narrative and a plot. And so I think this distinction is no longer useful. It's useful maybe for marketing books and it's useful for selling books, but not useful for me thinking about story and thinking about what I want to relate to or get out of a book.
Hundred
Yeah, Le
percent
Guin
on
would be
board
another
yeah,
one.
and
Yeah,
KJ Parker,
100%.
Allen. Yes.
Yeah. So many
Book.
of them. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And it's interesting, like, yeah, because when I think about what stays with me when it comes to a book, I know Philip's talked a lot about how much he loves themes in books, and I say the same thing about myself. And I know I'm always afraid that sounds a little highbrow to say, like, I'm a thematic reader, but I am. Like,
Yeah.
themes are important because they
Yeah.
are about what transcends the book,
Mm-hmm.
right? What's transcendent in the story, but also intimate in the story. I feel like it's the
Mm-hmm.
micro and the macro exploration of the human condition. And so, like, for me, that is what I gravitate towards, and it is what
Yeah.
stays with me. When I think about what stays with me in a book, I probably won't remember all the plot points in it,
Yeah.
but I'm gonna remember the emotional moments, the friendship, the bonds
Mm-hmm.
that these characters had with each other at certain times, even the cringy one, but sorry, no spoilers. But yeah, so I'm gonna remember certain emotional moments and
Mm-hmm.
the deeper exploration of what does it mean to be a friend. I'm gonna
Yeah.
remember that more than anything else. And so those are the kinds of things that stay with me when
Mm-hmm.
I'm reading a book, not necessarily the plot and the twist that
Yeah.
might occasionally stay with me, but that's not necessarily what I remember when it comes to
Yeah.
a
I mean, I
story.
think for me, what themes I pull out of it are really important, but sometimes it's also just small moments that they write in.
Yes.
And something that like hit me reading Royal Assassins, so the second of the Farseer trilogy, is this one small scene where Patience, so Fitz's would be his stepmother, right?
Yeah.
She just basically is like he realizes that she gave up everything to come take care of him. Like she left her kingdom, or not her kingdom, but where she was in charge, and she gave up everything so she could be here to, be a mother to him in the only way she knew how. And he hadn't realized that up until this point. He just thought she was someone else who was like, creating obstacles for him basically. And she's like, no, I gave up everything so I could be a mother to you. And like that, when he realized that, was so profound, right? Like what it means to give up so much, and considering her relationship with him, right? Because he's not really her son, right? He's her husband's bastard. So like still giving up everything to have that connection to her husband who's passed away, and being willing to do that for him, like that expression of devotion of a parent and devotion to your loved one who's passed away was like so profound. And it's like one page, right? It's like
Oh,
one thing, right?
yes.
But like it grabbed me when I read it, and I'm like, this is something I take away from this, is like this relationship right here and what it means to see yourself as a complicated person and trying to deal with a complicated situation, but like express your love for a child in this way or for a loved one in this way. What you're willing to give up and sacrifice for people that you feel are important.
Oh,
You know,
I love that, especially because I feel like from self-sacrifice is one of the themes that really spoke to me in the Farseer
mm,
trilogy. And it's amazing how you found it just in the instance of the stepmother scene,
mm,
which is like you mentioned, just a short scene in the
So
series.
I think what Angela is saying as well in the chat, can we sever characters and themes, and the themes have to live in these moments. The themes
mhm,
have to live
mhm.
and in these moments that we feel connected to,
Yeah,
those are the beautiful moments that transform us and allow us to reflect on our own existence in such beautiful ways. But yeah, they have to live through the characters. Yeah.
yeah.
Yes, I agree. Beautifully said. Yeah. Um, and we also got a question here. But I think, let's see. Yes, I got a question here about what books you're interested in reading in the near future. So obviously you're going to be finishing the Farseer trilogy. And
Yeah. Um, my TBR list is endless. And
as it is for us all.
Common
And I'm sure
problem
it's even
around
longer
here.
now that you're part of our community.
Yeah.
I will say, part of this is like a very first world problem, but part of my problem right now is I have a lot of arcs that I've committed to reading. And when you're someone who, like me, who's not famous, and so you request arcs and you never know if you're going to get them or not, and then all of a sudden you get more than you expected. And like if I get given an arc, I want to read it, because I've said I would, right? And that I'm going to try to be respectful of, this artist giving me their work. And so like right now, I know for the next month I have like, if I want to finish these books by the publication date, I have I think 12 books I need to read before the end of November, and it's like overwhelming a little bit to me. It's like an abundance of riches, and so like right now, it's hard for me to make bigger plans because I have so many other things to read. But part of that, the good part of that is, so I want to read The Realm of the Elderlings, and normally I would just go through them all. Like once I finish one, I just pick up the next one. But now since I have these other commitments, I'm not going to read more than one a month. I'm gonna like I just don't think I can. Maybe I will next year when I get closer to the end or something. I don't know. But like right now, reading more than, especially because they're big, like at least in the first trilogy, everyone gets longer. Each book is bigger than the one before it. I don't know how the rest of the trilogies work. So the nice thing about having these other obligations is it's slowing down some of my reading of series. But I do want to read Malazan. I want to finish The Realm of the Elderlings in the fantasy world. I do want to read your trilogy, Philip. I bought it already with the intent to start reading it. I don't I don't like reading multiple series at once. Do you know what I mean? Just I like to. I'm not good at like starting one book of a series and moving to another series. Like I just don't, it doesn't work for me. There are a lot of really, really exciting horror books that came out in this last year that I'm excited about, and so I have a lot of horror on my docket that I want to read, but nothing jumps out. As far as fantasy goes, I'm gonna finish The Realm of the Elderlings. That's next. I want to read Swan Song, which is a really
Yeah.
famous book, right? A sci-fi kind of horror book, and that is on my TBR, like my immediate TBR. But other than that, I'm kind of a mood reader. Like I have these goals, but the TBR is so long that I just see, you know, when I get through my arcs and those are out of the way, like what I have space for in my mind, you know. That's kind of
Yeah.
how it is.
Oh, we know this issue. And if you watched Philip's video that was posted this morning, you know that he has a pretty extensive TPR as well.
Yeah.
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 I will say though, from my side, I don't feel. I know some people get overwhelmed by having like a really big TBR, and it like is difficult for them to navigate. And for me, I don't mind because I'm never gonna read every book that I want to. Like it's just not. Like
That's
literally, new
right.
books are published every month that are interesting, and new books, like there's just constantly more and more to read, and that's wonderful. So, if I never read Malazan, like I want to because so many people speak so highly of it. But you know what? There are a lot of other great books, and like I don't think my life is going to end by not reading that. So having a huge TBR, especially for someone like me who I do like emotional reading. So I finish a book, and if I have free reign over what to read next, it just depends on how I feel. So I don't mind having a big TBR because I'm not
Yeah.
going to read all of them.
So if we have to choose between never being able to read all the books we want to read and running out of books to read, I think we all know which one we would
Yeah,
choose, right?
right. Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
That's well put. That's exactly well put.
I have not read Swan Song. Talking Story here, John says that is so good, but I have read Boy's Life. And
Hmm.
I know a lot of people recommend that to Stephen King fans specifically, and I think that's a very good recommendation. It's definitely, I would say, I would put it in the fantasy realm. It's magical
Hmm.
realism fantasy with
Hmm.
a little bit of horror in there and maybe a little bit of mystery, but it definitely evokes that summer feeling of young
Hmm.
kids riding bikes all day, that kind of idea. So I think I would highly recommend that. But I have heard that Swan Song is comparable to The Stand by Stephen King
Yeah.
as well. So
Definitely in page count.
yeah, it looks
Yeah.
huge. It
Yeah.
looks
It's a big
huge.
one.
Yes. Well, I really look forward to your Farseer review, and I really look forward to
yeah.
hearing your Edan trilogy review whenever you get to it.
Yeah. I've been enjoying doing reviews of trilogies as a whole
Mhm.
because if you're going to review a whole trilogy, you have to be very careful with what you say, right? Because you don't want to
Yes.
spoil anything in the first few books. So it makes me really look at like overarching themes and ideas that I can talk
Yeah.
about that cover the whole trilogy. So I did a review of Between Earth and Sky trilogy and did a review of the Southern Reach trilogy recently, and I found that I enjoy reviewing whole trilogies. So once I finish the Farseer trilogy, I'll probably do a review of that whole trilogy. And going forward, if I do read more trilogies, I think that I enjoy the effort, like the intellectual effort it takes to create a review that expresses how my understanding of it without giving anything away is like more work. Where like on one book it's easier, but to talk about a whole trilogy. So I will be doing one soon. Well,
Yes.
in a month, I guess, when I finish the next
Absolutely.
book.
And this is going to be a good way for me to shout out, by the way, that Philip Chase's the first book of the Edan trilogy now has an audiobook
Oh
that's
yes.
been recently released. And the audiobook narrator, Alan from the Library of Alexandria, he was in the chat. He was ranting about KJ Parker earlier and getting mad
Mm.
at everybody for not reading KJ Parker. But I'm sure he would also, if he's still here, I'm sure he'll also want everybody to pick up the Way of Edan audiobook, in
Yeah.
addition to some KJ Parker.
Since you brought it up, I do want to make a quick plug, just because
Oh,
Alan
please.
did such a wonderful job on this. He worked really, really hard, and it shows. And
Mm.
yes, he's immensely talented, but I don't feel that you get very far in life just by talent. You have to work really hard, and he did, and it just so professional. Such a
Mm.
wonderful job, and I keep saying it. You probably heard me say it too many times already, but his ability to put on all these different voices
Mm-hmm.
is just amazes me when I listen to like, who is this person? Because you hear Alan do these different accents and these different voices. Even the tiniest little characters get their distinct, mannerisms and everything and their inflections. And it's really tremendous what he's done with this audiobook. I feel very strongly that nobody can have him until the Aden trilogy is done. But when that's done, there's going to be a line of people, I think, wanting to ask Alan to narrate their books. I would be shocked if there isn't.
I'm so excited to hear that. And also Broken Binding editions coming out soon of The Way of Edan, or the whole trilogy. Is it the whole trilogy?
Well, I think it will depend on how well the first book does.
Oh, okay.
If the Way of Adan sells out, I think they're going to make 1,000 copies. Then probably, I think we can count on. I think we're pretty sure there'll be books 2 and 3. But if book 1 only sells 10 copies or 100 copies or something, then yeah, probably not. Yeah, it'll depend on how it goes. But I think the plan right now is to do all 3 books. Yeah.
Yay. Well, congratulations on that, Philip. I'm so excited about
Thank
that.
you.
I
Yeah.
I know we're wrapping up now, but I'd be interested to know. You said you're writing a sequel to that
Yes.
trilogy. You
Yes.
spent 18 years writing the trilogy. What is the experience of now writing the sequel feel like after having
Okay.
spent that much time birthing the? And I saw your video when you talked about your experience publishing it and how you published them all in 1 year, and you would
Yeah.
consider maybe you wouldn't have done that if you. It's something to think about, like that release schedule and all and so forth. But having gone through that now and spending so long birthing this thing, and now to go back to it, I imagine it's not going to take you. I mean, I don't know, but probably not 18 more years to write the
No.
sequel. So,
No.
what is the experience like going back to that world?
Yeah. Well, first I should admit that I cheated, and I actually wrote 4 books in 2 decades, and this sequel is the 4th book. I wrote
I
it
see.
not long after I wrote the 3rd book in the trilogy.
I
And
see.
it does pick up some of the characters and the concerns and the themes of that 3rd book in some ways, but going back to it, yeah, I mean, I think I'm not done with this world. I think I'm going to write some more books in this world, probably some standalones. Maybe going back a little further in history, maybe taking some characters that I'd like to revisit. Urd is one character I'd like to maybe see what she was like when she was younger. But you know, it is a world that I spent a lot of time creating, and I always love being there. So when I brought out the manuscript because I knew I wanted to edit it, there were certain things I already knew I wanted to shape a little differently, but because of things that I did while revising the trilogy affect things that are in the sequel as well. But it is fun. I just love it. I guess this is a full circle moment here, because we started out in the beginning talking about creativity and how fulfilling it is, and it is really one of the most fulfilling things I've ever engaged in my life is writing and reading, and talking about writing and reading too with really fun, cool people like you two and the people in the chat. So it's a great experience. I need to get back to it a little more. I'm kind of busy with all the stuff I'm doing. So I haven't been able to make as much progress on that sequel. It's called While Darkness Gathers, by the way, is the title.
And it's a novella, is that correct? How long is that going to be?
It's shorter than even the shortest, and even than The Way of the Dan, but it's not a novella. It's still a novel.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's still, I can't remember exactly, but somewhere close to 100,000 words. So yeah, that's novel length. But it's shorter. It's a little experiment in a way, because I guess I'm a little old school in the descriptions and things. I love landscapes, and I love, I don't think
I do too. Well, I love your landscapes too.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Good. I'm glad someone does.
No, I'm a settings person. Well, it's kind of weird. I say that, and I love Ishiguro, who is very minimal. But I do, like, when it comes to fantasy, like, I want to be immersed. I want to be in the world. Like, I don't, so I don't understand that lack of or that criticism if you've received it. So
no, I haven't really, honestly. But I thought I would try this experiment to make this one a slightly different creature. That have much shorter chapters, so we'll see how it goes. I'm having fun with it, though.
Nice. I'm glad you're having fun with it. And when will that be released? You said
I don't know yet. I keep feeling like it's sooner. I keep saying it's going to be out by this time, and then I realize, oh wait, no, it's not. So I feel like early next year, though.
Yeah.
Be
we got some funny comments here about how that's a 5-year average, still beating George R. R. Martin. And that let's see, delaying the sequels for decades. What was it? And then Philip outdoing Sanderson as the king of secret projects.
Oh my
That is so funny. And then we also got a question here. Can you tell us when those broken binding editions will be released? As I would love to get my hands on them.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I don't know the date yet, but everything is in place. So they have all the interior art, all the map, the cover, everything is out and ready. So it's just a matter of putting it all together and publishing it. I expect very soon to know about the release date, and I'll be shouting about it as soon as I get word from the binding. Yeah.
That's wonderful. So I just wanted to make sure that we got that in before closing for today. But I kind of think this was a perfect matching because, we talked, I think you mentioned earlier, Philip, about how Buddhism, the notion of impermanence, right? And then you're also a medievalist, Philip. So it's like, I know medievalism, you've talked quite a few times about life's fleetingness, how that's
Oh,
often
evasive
explored in medieval.
in Old English. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I feel like these are kind of complementary views, in
Beowulf
my
hates Buddhism, right? Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, in my opinion. I don't know. So I really greatly appreciated your time today. Thank you so much, Lecton, for taking the
Yeah.
time. I know it's very
Thank you
late
for
where you
inviting
are.
me.
Oh,
You know,
it's
a
my
little bit.
pleasure. My pleasure.
2 a.m.
2 a.m. My goodness.
Yeah.
You
Well,
and Beth.
I had a tremendous time too. I just
Yeah,
want to
me
say
as well. Thank you so much.
thank you to Joanna Lecton. I really enjoyed meeting you. This has been such a
Yeah.
pleasure. I will be checking out your Farseer / Realm of the Elderlings journey and other things. Just excited to see what you think there. And thank you everybody in the chat as well.
Yes,
Yeah,
and
thank you.
thank you both, Lecton, and thank you, Philip. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. And I was just excited because I get the pleasure of buddy reading some wonderful books with you, Philip, and
Yep.
having gotten to talk about your series with you in several chats. But it's also nice just to have this kind of conversation as well, once again. So I thank you for being a returning guest to Why Read. So
It's my
thank
pleasure.
Yay. Well, thank you, everybody. It was a wonderful chat. It was wonderful to have you all here. Appreciated you.
Thank you.
Wonderful seeing you again, Jeremy Fee. It's been a while. And yeah, I just wish you all to have a great rest of your day. So have a good one. Bye bye.